While visiting an orphanage for a publicity stunt, a millionaire was drawn to black twin girls. A routine DNA test for adoption revealed the impossible. They were his biological daughters from a forgotten relationship. His attempt at good publicity became a journey of redemption and family healing. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The air in Hope's Haven hung heavy with the scent of disinfectant and slightly burnt toast. Julian Thorne, accustomed to the crisp linen and expensive cologne of his penthouse, felt a prickle of unease. Sunlight streamed through the grimy windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stale air. He stood awkwardly amidst the cheerful chaos of the orphanage's common room, his tailored suit a jarring contrast to the worn furniture and brightly colored children's drawings adorning the walls. Two small figures, identical save for the subtle differences in their expressions, watched him from a shadowed corner. Maya, perhaps, with a hint of defiance in her dark eyes. Zara, her twin, with a quiet apprehension clinging to her posture. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing unnaturally loud. "Good morning," he offered, his voice a practiced baritone, far removed from the nervous tremor in his chest. The practiced smile felt strained, unfamiliar even to himself. Maya, without looking directly at him, simply nodded. Zara remained silent, her gaze fixed on a worn teddy bear clutched in her hands. He felt a strange pang, a feeling he couldn't quite name, a flicker of something akin to recognition. He tried again. I'm here to see about the adoption process." The words sounded hollow, even to his own ears. His carefully constructed public image, the compassionate philanthropist, felt like a flimsy mask about to crack. The contrast between the opulent world he inhabited and this stark reality was overwhelming, highlighting a chasm of guilt he'd been meticulously ignoring for years. A forgotten past threatened to engulf his present. The weight of it pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. The orphanage matron, Mrs. Gable, a woman whose smile line spoke of years spent nurturing broken spirits, offered Julian a cup of lukewarm tea. He declined, the porcelain cup feeling alien in his hand. The scent of antiseptic and old paper clung to the air, a stark contrast to the expensive perfumes that usually surrounded him. He watched Maya and Zara from across the small, cluttered room. They were drawing, their pencils scratching softly against paper, a shared silence humming between them. He felt a prickle of guilt, a sharp contrast to the carefully cultivated calm he usually projected. The girl's quiet resilience was a stark rebuke to his own carefully constructed life, a life built on avoiding uncomfortable truths. "They're remarkably alike," he said, his voice barely a whisper, the words sounding strange and foreign in the quiet room. Mrs. Gable smiled gently, her eyes holding a depth of understanding that unsettled him. "Yes, they are, but each has her own spirit. Maya's the bolder one, Zara, more reserved." He nodded, unable to meet her gaze. The DNA test loomed, a stark, unavoidable truth. The thought sent a cold shiver down his spine. The possibility, the terrifying, life-altering possibility of paternity gnawed at him, a persistent, unsettling ache. He pictured a fleeting image, a laughing woman with fiery red hair, a stolen kiss under a summer sky, a whispered promise quickly broken. The memory felt both vivid and distant, a phantom limb aching in the space of his forgotten past. Guilt, sharp and unforgiving, clawed at him. "The test results should be back tomorrow," Mrs. Gable said, breaking through his reverie. "Then we can proceed with the adoption process, if that's still what you wish." He looked at the twins again, their heads bent low over their drawings, their dark hair falling over their shoulders like a silken curtain. A sudden, unexpected surge of protectiveness washed over him, a feeling utterly alien yet undeniably powerful. The carefully constructed walls of his self-deception began to tremble. The weight of his past, long suppressed, threatened to shatter his carefully crafted present, and the potential future with these two girls hung in the balance. His breath hitched. He wasn't just a wealthy philanthropist considering a publicity stunt anymore. He was facing a life-altering reckoning. The sterile white of the clinic felt a million miles from the comforting, slightly musty scent of Hope's Haven. Julian sat, the smooth leather of the waiting room chair offering no comfort. He watched a fly lazily circle a discarded newspaper, its erratic flight mirroring the chaos swirling within him. The air hung heavy with the unspoken, a tangible weight pressing down. He hadn't slept properly in days. The memory of Maya and Zara, their quiet grace, their shared glances, haunted him. Their resemblance? It was uncanny. A nurse called his name, her voice a jarring interruption to his tormented thoughts. The small examination room was equally impersonal, the clinical scent of antiseptic a stark contrast to the faint sweetness of the girl's hair. He waited, each tick of the clock amplifying the pounding in his ears. He closed his eyes, the image of the laughing woman, fiery red hair cascading down her back, flooding his memory. Her name, Sarah, whispered from the depths of his carefully constructed denial. The doctor entered, holding a file. Julian's breath caught in his throat. He saw the doctor's lips move, but the words were lost in a rising tide of dread. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. He forced himself to focus, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Then, the doctor's voice, quiet yet undeniably clear. "Mr. Thorne, the results confirm paternity." The world tilted. The crisp white walls seemed to blur, the air thinning, stealing his breath. He felt a cold dread wash over him, paralyzing, silencing. The certainty of the words crashed down, shattering the carefully built walls of his self-deception. He'd built his life on forgetting, on burying the past. But now the past had risen, claiming him, his daughters. His carefully crafted reality fractured, the pieces scattering like shards of glass. This wasn't a publicity stunt gone wrong. It was a life-altering revelation, a chasm of guilt and regret yawning before him. He stumbled out of the clinic, the bright sunlight blinding, the sounds of the city a deafening roar against the silence within. He needed time, space, but escape felt impossible, the weight of his responsibility pressing down, a heavy cloak of guilt suffocating him. The future, once so clearly defined, was now a terrifying, uncharted territory. He had to tell someone. But who? How? The fear was palpable, a cold hand gripping his heart. His carefully constructed world lay in ruins. The car ride back to Hope's Haven was a blur. Julian stared out the window, the city's vibrant chaos a stark contrast to the turmoil within him. The sterile scent of the clinic clung to him, a ghostly reminder of the life-altering news. He hadn't spoken a word since leaving the doctor's office, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic thump of the tires on the asphalt. His expensive suit felt like a suffocating cage, the fine Italian fabric mocking his internal disarray. He glanced at his reflection in the darkened window. The man staring back was a stranger, etched with fatigue, his usually sharp features softened by a profound weariness. The carefully sculpted image he'd cultivated for years, the ruthless businessman, the impenetrable CEO, felt like a flimsy mask about to crumble. Reaching the orphanage, the familiar scent of antiseptic and slightly oversweetened disinfectant washed over him. It was a comforting smell, oddly enough, a stark contrast to the clinical sterility of the clinic. Hope's Haven, with its worn paint and slightly chipped window panes, felt more like home now than his opulent mansion ever had. He saw Sister Agnes near the entrance, her kind face etched with concern. "Mr. Thorne," she said softly, her voice laced with a quiet empathy that surprised him. "How are you feeling?" He hesitated, unable to articulate the tsunami of emotions crashing within him. I need to talk to you," he managed, his voice rough, betraying his inner turmoil. "Of course," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "Come in, please." The warmth of the common room, with its cheerful, albeit slightly worn, furniture, was a balm to his frayed nerves. The quiet hum of children's laughter drifted from a nearby room, a gentle melody against the deafening silence in his head. He watched them for a moment, their innocent joy a stark contrast to his own internal battle. He sat heavily in a chair, the worn fabric surprisingly comforting. The results, they were positive, he confessed, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. The twins, they're my daughters. Sister Agnes listened patiently, her expression unreadable. Only the gentle rise and fall of her chest betrayed her quiet emotion. He felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't the judgmental reaction he'd anticipated. Perhaps, just perhaps, this wasn't the end. I don't know what to do, he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. The weight of his past, the potential fallout, the implications for his public image, all threatened to crush him. He had no idea how to reconcile the man he was with the father he might become. The future stretched before him, a vast, uncertain landscape. He had to navigate this, not only for himself but for the two little girls whose lives had irrevocably intertwined with his. The responsibility felt monumental, terrifying, and yet, strangely, liberating. The orphanage's common room, usually a hub of cheerful chaos, felt strangely hushed. Sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air, a silent ballet mirroring the turmoil in Julian's heart. He sat opposite Sister Agnes, the worn floral pattern of her dress a stark contrast to his impeccably tailored suit. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, laden with unspoken anxieties. "They're so small," he finally whispered, the words catching in his throat. He hadn't dared to look at Maya and Zara since the clinic. The memory of their tiny hands, their quiet solemnity, haunted him. Sister Agnes' gentle smile offered a sliver of comfort. "They're resilient children, Mr. Thorne. They've faced hardships, but they possess a strength that belies their age." He nodded, unable to speak. The weight of his past, a carelessly flung seed that had blossomed into two beautiful lives he'd never known, pressed down on him. He pictured the woman, her laughing face, the way the sunlight used to catch in her hair. A memory so vivid, so sharp, it felt like a physical wound. I abandoned them," he choked out, the confession a bitter pill to swallow. The words felt inadequate, a paltry attempt to capture the enormity of his guilt. "The past is the past, Mr. Thorne," Sister Agnes said softly, her voice a soothing balm. "But the future is unwritten. You have the opportunity to make amends." He looked at her, searching her eyes for judgment, for condemnation. He found only compassion, a quiet understanding that surprised and moved him. A tear escaped, tracing a path through the creases etched around his eyes. The carefully constructed wall he'd spent years building, brick by painful brick, began to crumble. The weight of his actions, of his self-deception, was finally too much to bear. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a father who had failed, a father who had a chance to redeem himself. The road ahead was daunting, terrifying even, but for the first time in a long time, Julian Thorne felt a flicker of hope. A fragile, hesitant hope, but hope nonetheless. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to Julian's clothes, a stark contrast to the comforting aroma of lavender and old books that permeated Hope's haven. He sat in his chauffeured car, the plush leather doing little to soothe the tremor in his hands. The DNA results echoed in his mind, a relentless hammer blow against the carefully constructed walls of his life. He stared at his reflection in the window, a stranger staring back, eyes shadowed with exhaustion, a mouth drawn thin with a grief he hadn't allowed himself to feel. Sister Agnes' words played on repeat. "You have the opportunity to make amends." Amends? How could he possibly make amends for a lifetime of self-deception, for a life lived devoid of genuine connection? The thought of facing Maya and Zara, of explaining the impossible truth, felt like walking a tightrope over an abyss. He pushed the car door open, the cool night air a shock to his overheated skin. The orphanage was quiet, the usual sounds of children's laughter muted. He approached the building, its familiar silhouette looming large in the darkness, a stark reminder of the life he'd so easily disregarded. He could almost feel the weight of his past pressing down on him, crushing him beneath its weight. He found Sister Agnes in the small chapel, kneeling before a flickering candle. Her silhouette was peaceful, a stark contrast to the turmoil within him. He cleared his throat, the sound breaking the stillness. "Sister Agnes," he began, his voice barely a whisper. I need to talk to you." She rose, her face etched with concern. "Julian, come in. You look troubled." He followed her into the quiet sanctuary, the scent of incense mingling with the cool night air. He sat heavily on a worn wooden pew, the rough surface a surprising comfort against his tailored suit. He hesitated, unsure how to begin, how to articulate the tsunami of emotions crashing within him. The results? They confirmed it. He finally managed, his voice thick with unshed tears. "They're my daughters." Sister Agnes nodded, her gaze compassionate. "I suspected as much," she said softly. "Their resemblance. It was striking." She paused, allowing the weight of the revelation to settle between them. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the soft crackle of the candle flame. "How do you feel, Julian?" He looked down at his hands, his knuckles white as he clenched them together. "Fear," he whispered, "a crushing weight of fear and guilt. I don't know what to do." His voice cracked, the carefully constructed facade crumbling under the weight of his revelation. The fear wasn't just for his public image, his carefully constructed life. It was for the girls, for the fragile hope he'd inadvertently shattered. The stakes were higher than he'd ever imagined. Sister Agnes' hand rested gently on his, a surprisingly comforting weight. "Fear is natural, Julian," she said, her voice a calming balm. "But it doesn't have to control you. You can choose a different path." He looked up at her, surprised by the strength in her quiet words. The chapel, usually a place of peaceful contemplation, now felt charged with a raw, unsettling energy. The flickering candlelight danced across the worn wooden pews, casting long, dancing shadows. He swallowed, the lump in his throat constricting his breath. "But what if they hate me?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken anxieties. He pictured Maya and Zara, their quiet reserve masking a depth of resilience he hadn't appreciated before. The thought of their potential rejection was a fresh wound, raw and painful. Sister Agnes smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. "They've known only hardship, Julian. They've learned to protect their hearts. But beneath that guarded exterior lies a deep longing for love and belonging. Give them time, give them patience. Show them who you truly are, not the man the world sees, but the man you are capable of being." He closed his eyes, picturing Maya's shy smile, Zara's quick wit. He'd seen glimpses of their vulnerability, their quiet strength. He'd dismissed it as a charming quirk of orphans, but now he saw it differently. He saw a reflection of his own past, a yearning for connection he'd suppressed for so long. The weight on his chest lessened, replaced by a flicker of hope, a fragile ember of possibility. I need to see them," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The fear still lingered, a cold hand gripping his heart, but a new feeling stirred within him, a tentative yearning, a hesitant desire to make amends. He stood, a newfound resolve strengthening his posture. The cool night air rushed in as he stepped out of the chapel, leaving the comforting stillness behind. He walked towards the children's dormitory, the soft glow from the windows a beacon in the darkness. The path ahead remained uncertain, fraught with challenges. But for the first time in a long time, Julian felt a stirring of purpose, a faint echo of hope whispering in the quiet night. The journey to redemption wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to begin. He found them in the common room, Maya meticulously arranging building blocks, Zara engrossed in a worn copy of Alice in Wonderland. The air hummed with the quiet energy of bedtime preparations. The scent of lavender from Sister Agnes's nightly cleaning lingered, a comforting fragrance in the otherwise stark room. Julian hesitated at the doorway, the weight of his secret pressing down on him. The girls, heads bent to their tasks, hadn't noticed him yet. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the hushed space. Maya looked up, her dark eyes widening slightly. Zara, ever the quicker of the two, glanced up with a flicker of suspicion in her gaze. Neither spoke, their silence a heavy curtain between them and the man who stood awkwardly before them. I wanted to see you both," he began, his voice rougher than intended. The words felt clumsy, inadequate to express the torrent of emotions swirling within him. He watched their faces, searching for any clue to their thoughts. Maya's gaze remained guarded, but a hint of curiosity flickered in Zara's eyes. "About the test," he continued, his fingers tracing the seam of his expensive trousers, a nervous habit he'd never quite broken. The air crackled with unspoken tension. The simple wooden blocks in Maya's hands seemed to hold the weight of the world. Zara, ever the pragmatist, spoke first. "It's confirmed." Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but the question held an unexpected sharpness. He nodded, the simple movement heavier than a mountain. "Yes." The word hung in the air, stark and undeniable. He saw the slight tremor in Maya's hand as she carefully placed a block back in its box. He saw the way Zara's eyes darted to her sister, a silent communication passing between them. It was in that shared glance that Julian saw the depth of their bond, a connection that mirrored the one he longed to forge with them. The weight of his past mistakes pressed down on him with renewed force. He had to find a way to mend this. He had to show them he was worthy. The silence stretched, thick and heavy as the humid night air clinging to the orphanage walls. The faint scent of antiseptic battled with the lingering sweetness of overripe fruit from the kitchen. Julian felt the weight of his confession pressing down, a physical burden mirroring the turmoil within. He shifted his weight, the expensive fabric of his suit a stark contrast to the worn wooden floorboards beneath his feet. Maya, ever the cautious one, finally spoke, her voice barely a breath. "What does this mean?" Her gaze was fixed on her hands, twisting a small, worn button in her fingers. The button, once bright, was now faded and chipped, a miniature reflection of her own fragile hope. Zara, however, met his gaze directly, her eyes dark and intense. "Does it mean we're going to leave?" A tremor ran through her voice, betraying the carefully constructed composure she usually maintained. Julian's throat tightened. The question felt like a physical blow, a stark reminder of the chasm separating his world from theirs. I don't know," he stammered, the words a pathetic attempt to bridge the vast distance. He wanted to reassure them, to promise stability and security, but the very idea felt treacherous, a violation of their fragile peace. He watched as Maya's shoulders slumped, the tiny button falling unnoticed to the floor. Zara's carefully controlled demeanor cracked, revealing a flicker of fear beneath the surface. He saw the unspoken fear in their shared glance, the fear of abandonment, a fear he himself knew intimately. The reality crashed down on him. This wasn't a simple adoption. This was a reclamation, a desperate attempt to rectify a past he'd buried deep within. He saw himself reflected in their guarded eyes, the ghost of the careless young man who'd walked away without a second glance. The weight of his past actions pressed down harder now, crushing him beneath the burden of his own making. He knelt, the unexpected movement jarring in the stillness of the room. The hard wooden floor offered no comfort, yet it felt less foreign than the plush carpets of his own mansion. He looked into their eyes, searching for understanding, for forgiveness. "I want to be your father," he whispered, the words catching in his throat, thick with emotion. The words felt raw, vulnerable, a stark contrast to the carefully crafted image he'd presented to the world. His carefully constructed persona began to crumble, falling away to reveal the insecure man struggling to find his place, to find his worth. The journey he thought would be a simple publicity stunt had become a desperate quest for redemption. The journey had begun. The air hung heavy with unspoken questions. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of moonlight slicing through the orphanage window, illuminating the worn wooden floorboards where Julian knelt. The silence, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a distant clock, felt suffocating. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, to brush a stray strand of hair from Maya's face. She flinched, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but it spoke volumes. I didn't know, Julian whispered, his voice raw with emotion. The words felt inadequate, hollow, failing to capture the depth of his regret. He looked from Maya to Zara, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and wary curiosity. Zara, ever the bolder of the two, finally spoke. You didn't know we existed? Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, yet her eyes held a flicker of something unreadable. Hurt? Anger? Disappointment? Julian swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. No, he admitted, the word hanging in the air like a confession. I was young, foolish. I made a terrible mistake. He didn't need to elaborate. The unspoken words hung between them, heavy and suffocating. He felt the weight of their unspoken judgment, a silent accusation that echoed the self-recrimination gnawing at his soul. He'd built an empire, a life of luxury and success, all while ignoring the gaping hole in his heart, a hole only these two girls could possibly fill. The irony wasn't lost on him. Maya, ever the quiet observer, finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. Why are you here now? The question cut through him, sharp and precise. He looked at the chipped paint on the windowsill, the cracked plaster on the wall, a stark contrast to the polished marble and gleaming surfaces of his own world. He knew he couldn't offer them that world. Not yet. Not without earning their trust, their love. Because I want to be your father, he repeated, the words gaining strength, conviction. He looked into their eyes, searching for some sign of acceptance, of forgiveness. He saw a glimmer of hope, a flicker of possibility in the depths of their dark eyes. The journey had just begun, a long and arduous path toward redemption, toward healing, toward a family finally found. The silence, though still present, felt less heavy now, tinged with a fragile sense of anticipation. The scent of antiseptic still lingered, but now it was mingled with the faintest whisper of hope. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to the air, a stark contrast to the floral perfume Julian usually wore. He sat awkwardly on a small, chipped chair, the uncomfortable plastic digging into his expensive suit. Maya and Zara sat opposite him, their hands clasped tightly in their laps. The orphanage's quiet hummed around them, the distant murmur of children, the creak of a floorboard, a soft cough from the hallway. It was a world away from his polished penthouse. Julian shifted, the silence stretching taut between them. He cleared his throat. The results, he began, his voice a strained whisper. The words felt heavy, laden with the weight of his past. He avoided their gazes, focusing instead on a peeling poster of a cheerful cartoon sun. Zara, her brow furrowed, spoke first. They said, "You're our father?" Her voice was small, hesitant, betraying a vulnerability he hadn't expected. He nodded slowly, guilt twisting in his gut. "Yes," he whispered, the single word a confession, a lifetime of unspoken regrets spilling into the quiet room. He felt a prickling sensation behind his eyes, the beginnings of tears he desperately fought back. Maya, always the quieter twin, remained silent, her dark eyes fixed on him, assessing, questioning. Her expression was unreadable, a mask of composure hiding a whirlwind of emotions. Julian felt the weight of their scrutiny, the silent judgment. He'd lived a life of carefully curated public appearances, but here, in this stark, simple room, his carefully constructed facade crumbled. The small, worn wooden table between them seemed to stretch into a chasm, a gulf separating his world of wealth and privilege from theirs. He longed to bridge that distance, to reach across the chasm and touch them, to somehow alleviate the pain he'd caused, the years of absence. But the words eluded him, choked by a lifetime of repressed emotions. He knew a simple apology wouldn't suffice. He needed to show them, to prove his sincerity, not just with words, but with actions. The journey to redemption, he realized, was only just beginning. He'd have to fight for their trust, their forgiveness, one painstaking step at a time. The clock ticked relentlessly, marking the passage of time, the weight of his unspoken apologies pressing down on him. The fragile hope he'd felt earlier, threatened to extinguish under the weight of his past. The air hung heavy with unspoken words. Sunlight, filtering through the grimy orphanage window, illuminated dust motes dancing in the air, mirroring the turmoil swirling within Julian. He watched Maya, her face a stoic mask, her dark eyes pools of quiet intensity. Zara, ever more expressive, fidgeted, nervously twisting a loose thread on her worn dress. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I don't know what to say," Julian finally stammered, his voice cracking. The carefully constructed veneer of his public persona, usually impenetrable, had completely shattered. He felt exposed, raw. Zara's quiet voice cut through the silence. "You left us," she said, the words flat, devoid of anger, yet heavy with a lifetime of absence. The statement landed like a punch. Julian flinched. A flashback stabbed through him. A young woman, laughing, her hand on his. A fleeting moment of happiness he'd buried deep. He'd been a fool, blinded by ambition, by a fear of responsibility he'd never confronted. I made a terrible mistake," he managed, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He reached out, his hand hovering hesitantly above the table, then retreated. The gesture, clumsy and uncertain, spoke volumes. Maya, her expression unchanged, spoke for the first time. "Why?" Her voice was soft, but the single word carried the weight of years of unanswered questions, a lifetime of longing. He swallowed hard. "Fear," he whispered, the confession a bitter pill. "Fear of ruining everything I'd worked for. Fear of not being good enough." He looked at the twins, truly seeing them for the first time, not as a publicity opportunity, but as two vulnerable girls who deserved a father's love. His heart ached with guilt and a burgeoning sense of responsibility. He had to make it up to them. This wasn't a publicity stunt anymore. This was a fight for a chance to be a father. This was a journey toward redemption. The stark white paper felt brittle in Julian's trembling hand. The words, "Father," confirmed, swam before his eyes, blurring into a meaningless jumble. The sterile scent of the orphanage office, usually unnoticed, now clawed at his throat, a suffocating reminder of the chasm that yawned between his polished world and this raw, unvarnished reality. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the quiet air, a mockingly peaceful scene that clashed violently with the storm raging inside him. He sank into the unforgiving plastic chair, the cheap material digging into his expensive suit. The weight of the revelation crushed him. Not just the biological connection, but the crushing weight of his past, the years of self-deception and carefully cultivated indifference. He felt exposed, stripped bare, the carefully constructed facade of his public persona crumbling around him like ancient plaster. Maya and Zara, still sitting patiently, seemed oblivious to his turmoil. Maya's gaze, usually bright and inquisitive, was now distant, reflective, mirroring the profound uncertainty echoing in her silence. Zara, though fidgeted, twisting a small, worn wooden doll in her hands, her dark eyes darting nervously between Julian and her sister. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the faint ticking of a clock on the wall, each second a hammer blow against the fragile dam holding back his emotions. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. This can't be right." The denial was as much for their benefit as it was for his own. He needed time, a space to process the monumental shift in his life, a life meticulously planned and now irrevocably altered. Zara's quiet voice cut through his denial. "It is," she stated, her voice small but firm. Her eyes held a surprising depth of understanding, a sadness that resonated with a profound, chilling truth. The weight of their unspoken pain pressed down on him, heavier than any boardroom pressure he'd ever endured. The carefully crafted life he'd built, based on ambition and avoidance, felt hollow, meaningless. This wasn't a calculated risk, a publicity stunt gone awry. It was something far more significant, far more terrifying. A responsibility he'd run from for years, a debt he could no longer ignore. He saw a flicker of hope in Maya's eyes, quickly replaced with a guarded caution. He had to earn their trust, their forgiveness, their acceptance. He had to be a father. The enormity of that realization settled over him, a profound and terrifying truth. The journey had begun. The orphanage's quiet hummed around Julian, a stark counterpoint to the roaring storm in his head. The scent of disinfectant and faintly sweet laundry detergent, usually imperceptible, now felt suffocating. He stared at the DNA results, the crisp, official typeface mocking his inner turmoil. He felt the weight of the years, the carefully constructed walls of his life crumbling. Zara, ever watchful, traced patterns on the worn wooden floor with her small, bare foot. Maya, her twin, sat rigidly, her usual playful energy replaced by a quiet intensity. "So," Maya finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, breaking the suffocating silence. Her eyes, usually bright and full of life, held a cautious hope, a fragile thing that Julian felt a desperate need to protect. "What now?" He couldn't answer. The words caught in his throat, choked by the fear and the sudden, overwhelming guilt. He'd built his life on avoiding this, on burying the memory of a brief, reckless affair, a youthful indiscretion swiftly forgotten. Now, the consequences stood before him, their dark eyes reflecting the abyss of his past. Zara's gaze shifted to him, her expression unreadable. Are you going to leave?" The question hung in the air, fragile as a butterfly's wing. The thought stung. Leaving? The idea was a terrifying prospect, yet the ingrained habit of flight, of escaping difficult situations, clawed at him. His public image, his carefully curated life, all of it threatened by this unexpected revelation. The fear was a physical thing, a cold knot tightening in his chest. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, towards Zara's small hand, clutching the wooden doll. His touch was hesitant, uncertain, a stark contrast to the confident, decisive man he presented to the world. "No," he managed, his voice hoarse. The word felt inadequate, insufficient to express the turmoil within, the fear mingling with a nascent, fragile hope. "No, I'm not going to leave." It was a promise, a vow whispered as much to himself as to the two small girls who unknowingly held the key to his redemption. The weight of that vow settled upon his shoulders, heavy, yet strangely liberating. The journey to become a father was daunting. It would challenge his carefully built life, strip away his carefully constructed defenses. But within the chaos, a sliver of something else emerged: hope, trepidation. The seed of a new kind of life, built not on avoidance, but on acceptance. The sterile scent of the orphanage's antiseptic clung to Julian's expensive suit, a jarring contrast to the familiar aroma of leather and old money that usually enveloped him. He watched Maya and Zara, their identical faces etched with a quiet apprehension, as they clutched their worn dolls. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the distant squeak of a floorboard. He felt exposed, the carefully constructed facade of his public persona crumbling under the weight of the DNA results. I need some time," he stammered, his voice rough. The words felt inadequate, a pathetic attempt to mask the turmoil raging within. He saw the flicker of hurt in Maya's eyes, a mirroring of his own internal pain. Zara, ever the observer, simply nodded, her gaze unwavering. The tiny wooden doll in her hand seemed to absorb her anxiety. The contrast between their quiet acceptance and his inner chaos was stark. Julian retreated to the orphanage's small, dimly lit waiting room. The peeling paint and worn furniture whispered tales of countless children's hopes and dreams. The stark reality of his situation slammed into him. His carefully curated life, the polished image he'd spent years building, was irrevocably shattered. He was not just a successful businessman. He was a father, a role he never anticipated, a responsibility he felt woefully unprepared for. He pictured his penthouse apartment, the cold, gleaming surfaces reflecting the emptiness he'd always managed to keep at bay. Now that emptiness threatened to consume him. He pictured his sleek car, his perfectly tailored suits, These symbols of success felt suddenly meaningless, hollow shells against the vastness of his newfound reality. He needed to escape this suffocating guilt, this terrifying revelation. Yet, the thought of leaving these two girls, who unknowingly held the key to his redemption, was unthinkable. It was a terrifying responsibility, this unexpected fatherhood, a daunting journey into the unknown. The quiet hum of the orphanage faded into a dull roar in his ears. The weight of his actions, his omissions, his years of self-deception pressed down. He felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. Yet, in the quiet desperation, a fragile seed of hope began to take root. The orphanage's waiting room felt smaller, suffocating. Julian ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. The antiseptic sent a constant, jarring reminder of his predicament. The worn armchair creaked under his weight, a counterpoint to the frantic rhythm of his heart. He stared at his hands, noticing for the first time the tremor in his fingers. The polished veneer of his self-control was cracking. Maya's quiet strength, witnessed earlier, now felt like a rebuke. Zara's silent observation, a silent judgment. He hadn't considered the implications of his actions, the casual cruelty of his past life colliding violently with the innocence of these two children. He hadn't just fathered them. He'd abandoned them, a ghost in their lives until this absurd publicity stunt. A tear escaped, tracing a path through the expensive fabric of his shirt. He wiped it away roughly, embarrassed by his display of vulnerability. This wasn't how Julian Thorne, the titan of industry, was supposed to behave. A soft knock on the door startled him. He straightened, attempting to regain his composure. It was Sister Agnes, her kind eyes filled with a quiet understanding that unnerved him more than any judgment could. "Mr. Thorne," she said softly, her voice a calming balm against the storm raging within him. "The doctor wishes to speak with you privately about the results." The doctor, a kind woman with gentle hands and a reassuring smile, offered him water. Her words were gentle but firm. "The test is conclusive, Mr. Thorne. Maya and Zara are your daughters." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Julian felt a wave of nausea, his carefully constructed world dissolving around him. He looked at the pale, peeling paint on the wall, a symbol of his own decaying composure. He closed his eyes, the image of a younger self, careless and reckless, flashing behind his eyelids. The ghost of a lost love, a smile, a fleeting moment of happiness, then nothing. The silence in the small room was deafening. His carefully built life, his reputation, everything he'd ever worked for, felt like it was crumbling. The weight of responsibility, of paternity, of a past he'd tried to erase, felt unbearable. His carefully constructed world had shattered. His carefully curated life a lie exposed. The silence in the waiting room mirrored the cavernous emptiness within him. The weight of his actions pressed down. He was a father. He was a failure. He was lost. Julian stumbled out of the orphanage, the crisp autumn air doing little to clear the fog in his mind. The manicured lawns of his estate mocked him, their perfect symmetry a stark contrast to the turmoil within. He sank onto a wrought iron bench, the cold metal biting into his skin, a fitting reflection of his numb despair. The weight of the revelation pressed down. Two innocent girls, his daughters, living a life worlds away from his gilded cage. He pulled out his phone, the polished surface gleaming under the weak sunlight. He scrolled through recent news articles, his name splashed across the headlines, but they spoke of his philanthropy, his latest business venture, not of his secret family. The chasm between his public image and his private reality yawned before him, a terrifying abyss. He saw a text from Sister Agnes. Asterisk Maya and Zara are worried. They need you. Asterisk the words hung in the air, a simple plea that cut through his self-imposed isolation. He wanted to run, to disappear, to erase this inconvenient truth from his existence. But the image of Maya's quiet gaze, Zara's guarded curiosity, haunted him. Their vulnerability stirred something within him, a fragile tendril of paternal instinct he'd never known existed. The next day found him back at Hope's Haven. his expensive suit feeling absurdly out of place amidst the worn furniture and faded murals. He approached the twins hesitantly, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. "Maya, Zara," he began, his voice barely a whisper. The girls looked at him, their eyes guarded, a mixture of apprehension and hurt evident in their young faces. Maya spoke first, her voice small but steady. "Why did you leave, Mr. Thorne?" The question hit him like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He was speechless, the elaborate excuses he'd prepared dissolving into useless ashes. He could only stare at them, the unspoken guilt heavy in the silence that followed. Zara, ever the observant one, spoke softly. "We aren't asking for much, just to know you." He saw their small hands clasped together, a silent plea for connection. The polished facade he'd built began to crumble further, replaced by a raw, agonizing self-awareness. He wasn't just a businessman. He was their father, a title he hadn't earned, a responsibility he'd shirked for years. The realization hung in the air, heavy and inescapable, shaping the future in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. His journey of redemption had begun, and it would be long and arduous. The stale air of the orphanage's waiting room hung heavy with unspoken anxieties. Julian sat stiffly, the plush leather of the chair offering no comfort. He watched Maya and Zara, perched on a small, worn sofa, their hands clasped tightly. Sunlight streamed through the dusty window, illuminating the fine dust motes dancing in the air, mirroring the turmoil in his own soul. He hadn't spoken much since his return, the words catching in his throat like bitter ash. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Sister Agnes, her face etched with a compassionate understanding, entered softly. "Julian," she began, her voice gentle yet firm, "they need you to talk to them, not as Mr. Thorne, the philanthropist, but as their father." Her words struck a chord, a jarring dissonance with his carefully constructed persona. He looked at the twins again, their small shoulders slumped, their faces reflecting a mixture of hope and trepidation. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "Maya, Zara," he began, his voice a raspy whisper. I understand that you're hurt, angry." He paused, his gaze dropping to his hands. He felt the weight of his silence, the heavy burden of years of absence. He wished he could undo the past, erase the years he'd spent lost in his own world, but he knew that was impossible. Maya, ever the bolder of the two, looked up, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Hurt isn't the word for it, Mr. Thorne. Abandoned feels more accurate." "Why?" Her voice was small, yet laced with a strength that surprised him. Zara, her usual quiet demeanor replaced by a fragile vulnerability, added softly, "We just wanted to know you." The simplicity of her words cut through him like a knife. He couldn't offer easy answers, no slick, self-serving justifications. He could only offer the truth, a truth as raw and painful as the reality that faced them. He opened his mouth, intending to speak, but the words failed him once more, the weight of his past threatening to suffocate him. He saw the flicker of disappointment in their eyes, and the crushing weight of his own guilt intensified. The journey ahead would be long, a path paved with remorse, but the first step, the crucial first step, had been taken. The silence hung heavy once more, now imbued with a new, fragile hope. The seed of a connection, delicate as a newborn sprout, was beginning to take root. The mahogany door of Julian's penthouse apartment felt alien, cold against his palm. He'd spent the last hour staring at the cityscape, a million glittering lights mocking his internal darkness. The opulent space, usually a source of pride, now felt like a gilded cage. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. The quiet hum of the city was a stark contrast to the hushed, almost reverent quiet of Hope's Haven. He needed to speak to them again. He couldn't just leave them hanging, consumed by their confusion and hurt. But how could he explain his absence, the years he'd erased from his memory? The thought of facing their questions, their justifiable anger, paralyzed him. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid doing little to soothe the burning in his chest. The next day found him back at Hope's Haven. He sat awkwardly on the worn plastic chair, the scent of disinfectant and old wood filling his nostrils. Maya and Zara sat opposite, their silence a palpable presence. Sister Agnes watched from the doorway, her eyes conveying both hope and apprehension. I wanted to apologize," Julian began, his voice shaky. The words felt inadequate, pathetic even. Maya, her gaze unwavering, responded, "For what? For abandoning us? For showing up only because you were looking for good press?" Her voice was quiet, but each word carried the weight of years of unspoken resentment. Zara, usually the more reserved twin, spoke then, her voice a fragile whisper. "We saw the photos, Mr. Thorne. The ones of you at the gala, smiling. It felt like a slap in the face." The sting of her words was sharp, piercing the carefully constructed wall of self-protection he'd built around himself. He felt a wave of nausea, his carefully crafted composure crumbling. He saw the hurt in their eyes, the silent accusation that burned deeper than any words. He wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, but he hesitated, the fear of rejection still clinging to him. "I know I can't undo the past," he finally managed, his voice thick with emotion. "But I want to be a part of your lives now. He struggled to find the right words. "I'm your father." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken promises and the weight of his past mistakes. The girls simply stared at him, their expressions unreadable. The air hung heavy with unspoken emotions, a mixture of hope and uncertainty. The path to redemption was long and arduous, and the journey had only just begun. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the faint sweetness of the honeysuckle Julian remembered from his fleeting memory of their mother. He sat, stiff and uncomfortable, on a plastic chair in Sister Agnes's small office. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a scene of quiet domesticity miles away from the polished surfaces of his penthouse. Maya and Zara sat opposite him, their hands clasped tightly together. Their silence was a thick, suffocating blanket. "I understand if you need time," Julian began, his voice a low rumble, barely audible above the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the hallway. He avoided their eyes, focusing instead on the worn, peeling paint on the wall. He felt the weight of his past actions pressing down on him, a crushing burden. Zara finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Time for what, Mr. Thorne? To decide if you really want us, or if this was just a publicity stunt gone wrong." Her words, though soft, were sharp, like tiny shards of glass. He flinched. Maya, ever the bolder twin, met his gaze. Her eyes, dark and intense, held a chilling clarity. "We saw the articles, the ones about you and her, the woman at the gala." The bitterness in her voice was palpable. Julian's throat tightened. He had tried to bury that part of his life, but the past, it seemed, had a way of clawing its way back to the surface. Sister Agnes, a woman whose kindness was etched onto her face like a roadmap, intervened gently. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice calm and soothing, "the girls are understandably confused and hurt. This is a lot for them to process." Julian swallowed, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. He felt a desperate need to reach out, to touch them, to somehow convey the enormity of his regret, the depth of his desire to make amends. But the fear of rejection held him paralyzed. The weight of his past, the years of emotional detachment, felt insurmountable. He had to find a way to bridge the chasm he had created. The journey would be arduous. He knew this, but he also knew, with a certainty that surprised him, that he would not give up. He would fight for them. He had to. The humid air hung heavy in the cramped attic, thick with the scent of dust and forgotten things. Julian ran a hand over a chipped paint can, the rough texture grounding him in the present, a stark contrast to the smooth marble of his penthouse. This was the apartment above the bakery where he'd first met Isabella. A faded photograph, tucked into a creased corner, slipped from beneath the can. It showed Isabella, radiant, her laugh echoing in his memory even now, a vibrant counterpoint to the silence of the attic. He traced the outline of her face with a trembling finger. A wave of nausea washed over him. The bitter taste of regret coated his tongue, a familiar companion. He remembered the stolen kisses, the whispered promises, the fear that had choked him, silencing his heart and pushing her away. He'd built a wall around himself, brick by brick, until he was a fortress of solitude. He sank onto a dusty stool, the wood groaning beneath his weight. The ghosts of their life together whispered in the shadows, mocking his success, his wealth, his carefully crafted facade. He clutched the photo, the paper crinkling in his grasp. A sob escaped him, raw and ragged, shattering the silence. He was drowning in the weight of his past. The memory of Isabella's heartbroken eyes seared into his soul. He whispered her name, a choked plea lost in the suffocating silence. "Isabella," he murmured, tears blurring the edges of the photo. The image blurred into a shimmering haze. He closed his eyes, the image of Isabella's face burning into his mind's eye. The weight of his abandonment bore down on him, the enormity of his past mistakes suffocating him. The years of denial, of building that emotional wall, crumbled around him, revealing the fragile, broken man beneath. He had to face it. He had to fix it. He had to find a way to reach Maya and Zara, to somehow earn their forgiveness. The journey wouldn't be easy, but he had to try. He had to. The bakery smelled of warm bread and cinnamon, a scent that should have been comforting, but instead clawed at Julian's throat. He stood across the street, a ghost observing his past. The bell above the door jingled, a familiar sound that sent a shiver down his spine. He'd brought Isabella here all those years ago. He remembered the sunlight catching the dust motes dancing in the air, the way her laughter had filled the space, a melody now lost to silence. He pushed himself forward, his expensive suit feeling out of place amidst the simple charm of the bakery. The baker, a stout woman with flour dusting her apron, looked up, her eyes widening in recognition. "Mr. Thorne?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "Yes," he replied, his voice a low rumble. The words felt foreign, thick with unshed tears. "Isabella, she often spoke of you," the baker said softly, her gaze lingering on his face. "Said you were a good man." The words hung in the air, a cruel juxtaposition to the truth. He wasn't a good man. He was a coward. He swallowed, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. She was wonderful," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. The baker nodded, understanding lacing her features. "She loved making you those almond croissants," she said, a wistful smile playing on her lips. "Always said they were your favorite." The image of Isabella, her hands dusted with flour, carefully crafting those croissants, flooded his memory. He closed his eyes, the scent of warm almond pastry filling the air, a poignant reminder of his irretrievable loss. The bakery, once a symbol of happy memories, now felt like a mausoleum. He left the bakery, the weight of his past heavier than ever. He needed to make amends not just for Isabella, but for Maya and Zara. He pulled out his phone, the cold metal a jarring contrast to the warmth of his memories. He had to face them, face the truth, face himself. He dialed the orphanage, his finger trembling slightly. It was time. The orphanage's quiet hummed a stark counterpoint to the tempest raging inside Julian. He sat in his chauffeured car, the plush leather a cruel mockery of the worn chairs he'd seen in Hope's Haven. The scent of old paper and antiseptic still clung to him, a lingering ghost of his encounter with Maya and Zara. He'd fled, a coward, leaving them in the sterile calm of the orphanage while the revelation of his paternity gnawed at his soul. He hadn't slept. The image of the twins' innocent faces, their wary yet hopeful eyes, haunted his dreams. He'd envisioned himself as a benevolent benefactor, a savior offering them a better life. The reality was far more brutal. He was their father, a father who'd abandoned them, a father who'd lived a life of opulent detachment, while they'd grown up in a place of stark necessity. His phone vibrated, a jarring interruption to his turbulent thoughts. It was Mr. Davies, the orphanage director, his voice strained with concern. "Mr. Thorne," Davies began, "the girls, they're asking about you. Maya particularly. She seems worried." The word worried pierced Julian. He imagined Maya's small frame, her quiet strength, and a wave of guilt washed over him. I'll be there soon," he managed, his voice rough. The words felt inadequate, a pathetic attempt to soothe a wound he'd inflicted. He dismissed the driver, needing to clear his head before facing them. He found himself walking, the familiar streets of his affluent neighborhood seeming alien and hostile. He passed boutiques showcasing the latest fashions, restaurants promising culinary excellence, all things that felt hollow and meaningless now. He stopped, catching his breath, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He needed answers not just for them but for himself. He needed to understand the choices he'd made, the life he'd lived, and the man he'd become. The past couldn't be erased, but perhaps, just perhaps, it could be reconciled. He turned, his steps firm now, heading back towards Hope's Haven, not as a wealthy benefactor, but as a father, a flawed but determined father, ready to confront his past and embrace his future. The scent of rain filled the air, a cleansing presence that mirrored the desperate hope blossoming in his heart. He was going home, not to his mansion, but to the girls who needed him, his daughters who were waiting for him. The air hung heavy with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. Julian found himself standing before a small, weathered cottage, its paint peeling, the garden overgrown. This was it. The address he'd unearthed from faded photographs and fragmented memories. A tremor ran through him, a visceral reaction to the echoes of a life he'd tried to bury. He could almost hear laughter, the ghost of a melody from a happier time. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture betraying the turmoil within. He knocked, the sound swallowed by the quiet. A moment stretched, then a woman opened the door, her face etched with lines of time and hardship. Her eyes, though, held a familiar spark. "Julian?" she breathed, her voice raspy but kind. "Elena?" he whispered, the name a prayer on his lips. Recognition flickered in her eyes, then a flood of emotion, sadness, confusion, maybe a hint of forgiveness. "It's been so long," she said, her voice catching. He stepped inside, the cottage small but warm, filled with the scent of baking bread. Photographs lined the mantelpiece, capturing moments of a life he'd forgotten. A younger, carefree Julian, a radiant Elena, a burgeoning love. His heart ached with the weight of lost years. I wanted to understand," he stammered, his voice thick with emotion. He gestured to the photographs. I don't remember much." Elena's gaze softened. "You left," she said quietly, her voice filled with a quiet dignity that both surprised and humbled him. "Without a word. I never understood why." The silence hung heavy between them. He watched her face, the etched lines telling their own story of struggle and resilience. "Fear," he finally admitted, the word barely a whisper. "Fear of everything, of responsibility, of commitment, of failure." He ran a trembling hand across a photo of himself, young and arrogant. "I was a fool." A single tear traced a path down his cheek. Elena offered a tissue, her touch light but firm. He realized she had already forgiven him. Or perhaps she had simply accepted the reality of what had happened. The orphanage playroom, a riot of brightly colored plastic toys, felt jarringly out of place. Julian, used to the hushed elegance of his penthouse, found himself acutely aware of the worn carpet underfoot, the faint scent of disinfectant clinging to the air. Maya, perched on a tiny rocking horse, watched him with large, dark eyes, her gaze unwavering. Zara, meanwhile, meticulously arranged building blocks, her brow furrowed in concentration. He knelt, the movement clumsy and stiff. "So, the rocking horse, a favorite?" he asked, his voice sounding strange, too loud in the quiet room. Maya didn't answer, only continued her rhythmic rocking, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips. Zara, without looking up, simply shook her head. Julian felt a wave of self-consciousness wash over him. His carefully crafted public image, the polished veneer of success, felt utterly inadequate here. He cleared his throat. I understand if you're not comfortable," he stammered, the words failing to convey the genuine awkwardness he felt. "But I want to get to know you both." He reached out a hand, hesitant, towards Maya's. She flinched slightly, then slowly, tentatively, placed her small hand in his. Her touch was surprisingly gentle, unexpectedly warm. A faint tremor ran through him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, genuine connection. He spent the next hour attempting conversation, clumsy jokes falling flat, questions met with monosyllabic answers. Yet, despite the awkwardness, a fragile connection began to form. He learned Maya loved to draw, filling notebooks with fantastical creatures. Zara, he discovered, possessed an uncanny ability to solve complex puzzles. He saw glimpses of their intelligence, their resilience, their quiet strength, a stark contrast to the superficiality of his own life. Leaving the playroom, the weight on his shoulders felt slightly lighter. The journey ahead was daunting, but for the first time, the prospect of facing it didn't seem entirely impossible. He had a feeling he would need to be better, much better, to earn their trust. But he was willing to try. The following week blurred into a chaotic mix of hushed phone calls, strained smiles for the cameras, and stolen moments with Maya and Zara. Julian found himself drawn to the quiet rhythm of the orphanage, a stark contrast to the frenetic energy of his usual life. The scent of freshly baked bread, the cheerful chatter of children at playtime, the gentle hum of activity. It was a world away from his sterile penthouse apartment. One afternoon, he found Maya sketching in a worn notebook, her brow furrowed in concentration. He hesitated, then sat beside her, the worn wooden bench creaking softly beneath his weight. The pencil moved with a delicate grace, bringing fantastical creatures to life on the page. "They're incredible," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Maya flinched, her hand hovering over the page. "They're just things," she mumbled, her voice small and hesitant. "No," Julian countered softly. "They're beautiful. They're full of life." He pointed to a creature with iridescent wings and multiple eyes. "This one especially. What's its name?" A small smile touched her lips. "Ignis," she whispered, the name echoing the fiery hues of the creature's wings. It breathed stars. The simple act of sharing this small moment, this quiet connection over a fantastical creature, felt monumental. It was a crack in the wall he'd built around himself, a tiny opening into a world of genuine emotion. He felt a warmth spread through him, a feeling as unfamiliar as it was profound. He realized then that these weren't just biological daughters. They were people he needed to know, to understand, to cherish, and that understanding would take time, patience, and a willingness to dismantle the carefully constructed walls he had lived behind for so long. The journey to becoming their father had only just begun, and it felt both terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The weight of his past mistakes still pressed down, but now, a new kind of hope, fragile but tenacious, began to bloom within him. The following days were a blur of awkward silences and hesitant smiles. Julian, used to commanding boardrooms, felt utterly lost in the simple act of interacting with Maya and Zara. He brought them expensive toys, a miniature pony for Zara, a state-of-the-art drawing tablet for Maya, but the gifts felt clumsy, a poor substitute for genuine connection. He watched them play in the orphanage garden, their laughter echoing against the weathered brick walls, a sound both beautiful and heartbreaking. He saw the guardedness in their eyes, the subtle flinch when he reached out. One evening, while sipping lukewarm tea in the orphanage's Spartan common room, Zara looked up from her book, her gaze unwavering. "Why are you doing this, Mr. Thorne?" she asked, her voice quiet but clear. The directness of the question surprised him. He'd anticipated more resistance, more suspicion. He hesitated, the words catching in his throat. The scent of old wood polish and faintly sweet disinfectant hung in the air. He looked out the window at the setting sun casting long shadows across the lawn. Because I want to, he finally managed, his voice rough. I want to be your father. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. Maya, who had been quietly sketching, looked up, her dark eyes filled with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. Is that true? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. The flickering gaslight cast shadows on her face, making her appear both younger and older than her years. Julian nodded slowly, a lump forming in his throat. The weight of his past mistakes pressed down on him, but the desire to make amends, to prove his sincerity, burned brighter than ever before. It's true, he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. I made a mistake a long time ago, and I want to fix it. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers, his touch hesitant. This was the beginning, he realized, the slow, painstaking work of building a relationship built on trust and understanding, not grand gestures and expensive gifts. The journey was long and difficult, but for the first time, Julian felt the faintest glimmer of hope, a fragile light piercing through the darkness of his past. The following weeks were a delicate dance of tentative steps and awkward silences. Julian, accustomed to the crisp efficiency of his corporate world, found himself utterly flummoxed by the gentle chaos of the orphanage. The scent of bleach and faintly sweet disinfectant, initially jarring, now held a strangely comforting familiarity. He'd begun to notice the subtle nuances of the twins' personalities. Zara's quiet intensity, her eyes often lost in the pages of a well-worn book. Maya's boundless creativity, evident in the vibrant sketches that adorned every spare surface. One afternoon, he found them in the garden, huddled together under a gnarled apple tree, its branches laden with ripening fruit. The sunlight dappled through the leaves, casting a mosaic of light and shadow on their faces. He watched them, a quiet observer, his heart a mixture of longing and apprehension. He wanted to join them, to share in their quiet intimacy, but the fear of intrusion held him back. Finally, he cleared his throat, the sound surprisingly loud in the tranquil setting. Maya looked up, her brow furrowed in slight surprise. Zara remained absorbed in her book, seemingly oblivious to his presence. I brought some apples, he stammered, holding up a small bag. The apples, perfect and red, seemed oddly out of place in the rustic setting. Zara finally looked up, her dark eyes scrutinizing him. Thank you, Mr. Thorne, she said, her voice polite but distant. He sat down on a weathered bench, the rough wood digging into his tailored trousers. The discomfort was physical, mirroring the unease in his heart. You don't have to call me Mr. Thorne, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words felt strange and unfamiliar on his tongue. Maya, ever the quicker of the two, offered a small smile. Then what should we call you? He hesitated, the question surprising him with its simplicity. Julian, he finally said, the name sounding foreign even to him. Just Julian. He watched as a slow smile spread across Maya's face, mirroring the tentative hope blooming in his own heart. The scent of ripe apples and damp earth filled the air, a subtle perfume of a new beginning. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the lawn, a silent witness to this fragile, nascent connection. The journey was just beginning, and Julian knew it would require patience, understanding, and a willingness to shed the armor he'd worn for so long. The news broke like a rogue wave, crashing over Julian's meticulously constructed life. A tabloid headline, stark and unforgiving, screamed across the internet, "Millionaire's secret daughters." The accompanying photo, a grainy shot of him leaving Hope's Haven, his face etched with a mixture of guilt and apprehension, felt like a betrayal. His carefully cultivated image, the picture of success and control, was crumbling. His phone vibrated incessantly, a relentless barrage of calls and messages, each one a hammer blow to his already fractured composure. He silenced it, the sudden quiet only amplifying the roar in his ears. He felt trapped, the gilded cage of his wealth suddenly suffocating. He paced his penthouse apartment, the panoramic city view blurring into an indistinguishable mass of lights. The city that had once symbolized his triumph now felt like a hostile landscape. He thought of the twins, their quiet strength, their innocent eyes. The thought of them caught in this maelstrom of public scrutiny filled him with a cold dread. He had to protect them, shield them from the harsh glare of the media spotlight. But how? His usual strategies, money, power, influence, felt utterly useless in this new, terrifying reality. He sat heavily on the plush sofa, the expensive fabric feeling strangely alien against his skin. His reflection stared back at him from the polished surface of the coffee table. A man on the verge of collapse, his carefully constructed facade dissolving into a mask of raw vulnerability. He picked up his phone again, his fingers trembling. He had to do something, anything, to navigate this crisis. He dialed the orphanage, his voice a low murmur against the storm raging inside him. "Sister Agnes," he said, his voice strained. "I need to talk to you. This situation, it's gotten out of control." He could hear the concern in her voice, the quiet strength that had always impressed him. He felt a flicker of gratitude, a tiny spark of hope in the encroaching darkness. "I need your help." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of his predicament, a desperate plea for guidance in a world suddenly turned upside down. The conversation was brief, efficient, yet laden with unspoken anxieties and shared apprehension. The storm outside raged, mirroring the tempest in his heart. His carefully constructed world was shattered, and the only thing he knew to do was fight, not just for himself, but for the two girls who unexpectedly held the key to his redemption. The orphanage's quiet hum, the gentle rustle of fabric, the soft murmur of children's voices, offered a stark contrast to the maelstrom in Julian's mind. He sat in Sister Agnes' small, sun-drenched office, the scent of old books and faintly sweet lavender clinging to the air. His expensive suit felt out of place, a jarring note in the room's simple serenity. They're saying terrible things," he mumbled, his voice rough, the words catching in his throat. He avoided Sister Agnes' gaze, his eyes fixed on a chipped porcelain doll on the desk. The doll's painted smile seemed mockingly cheerful. Sister Agnes placed a comforting hand on his. Her touch, surprisingly strong, grounded him. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice calm and steady. "The media can be unforgiving, but Maya and Zara are safe here." "Safe?" The word echoed in the small room, bitter and ironic. "Safe from me, perhaps?" He felt a wave of self-loathing wash over him, the familiar chill of his emotional detachment returning. "No, Mr. Thorne. Safe from the chaos you're facing. We'll protect them." Her eyes, though kind, held a steely glint. "But you need to decide how you'll protect them. Will you run, or will you fight?" Julian winced. Running felt instinctive, a reflex honed over years of avoiding difficult truths. But the thought of abandoning Maya and Zara, of leaving them to face this alone, twisted something inside him. I don't know what to do," he admitted, the words a confession of his own inadequacy. He felt the weight of his past, the years of emotional neglect, bearing down on him. This wasn't just about his reputation. It was about the two little girls who were looking to him for strength, for protection, for a father. Sister Agnes squeezed his hand. "Then fight, Mr. Thorne. Fight for them. Fight for yourself." She paused, her gaze unwavering. "And fight for the truth." The simple words held a power that shook him to his core. The sun streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a fragile beauty amidst the storm brewing outside. Julian knew, with a certainty that surprised him, that he had to fight. He had to fight for his daughters. He had to fight for his redemption. The battle had begun. The headline screamed from the tabloid's cover. "Millionaire's secret daughters?" Julian stared at the lurid image, a blurry shot of him leaving Hope's Haven, his face etched with worry, feeling a cold dread seep into his bones. The scent of stale coffee and fear filled his expensive hotel suite. He hadn't slept properly in days. His phone buzzed relentlessly, a symphony of angry calls and accusatory messages. He silenced it, the vibration a physical assault on his already frayed nerves. He felt trapped, a caged animal desperate for escape, yet knowing any movement would only worsen the situation. He thought of Maya and Zara, their quiet resilience a stark contrast to the media frenzy. He pictured their faces, their wide, dark eyes, reflecting the confusion of their new reality. Guilt gnawed at him. He'd promised Sister Agnes he'd protect them, but how could he when the entire world was watching, judging, condemning? A knock on the door jolted him. His lawyer, a stern woman named Ms. Davies, entered, her expression grave. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice low, "the damage control is extensive. Several brands are already distancing themselves. Your reputation is in tatters," Julian finished, his voice flat. He didn't need her to tell him. He already knew. The weight of his actions, of his past, pressed down on him, suffocating. "We can try to manage the narrative. Spin it," Ms. Davies offered, her voice tight with professional restraint. "But it will be a long, difficult battle." Julian ran a hand through his hair, the gesture revealing the exhaustion etched on his face. "Spin it?" he scoffed, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "How do you spin the truth? How do you spin abandoning your own daughters?" Ms. Davies' expression softened, a flicker of empathy breaking through her professional facade. "Mr. Thorne, you can still salvage this. You can use this situation to show a different side of yourself." He looked at her, his eyes hollow, his heart heavy. "A different side?" he whispered, the words barely audible. "What if there is no different side?" The question hung in the air, a silent testament to the depth of his self-doubt, his fear. The battle for his reputation had begun, but a far greater battle, the fight for his own redemption, for his daughter's well-being, had already commenced within his soul. The future felt uncertain, terrifyingly so, but for the first time, the thought of fighting didn't fill him with dread. It filled him with a desperate, fragile hope. The harsh glare of the television screen illuminated Julian's face, the relentless news cycle a relentless hammer blow. Images of Hope's Haven, interspersed with shots of his own opulent estate, pulsed with a sickening rhythm. The air hung thick with the scent of fear and stale takeout containers. He hadn't eaten in days. Each news report felt like a personal indictment, each headline a fresh wound. A sharp rap on the door startled him. It was Sister Agnes, her face etched with worry but her eyes unwavering. She carried a small, worn teddy bear, Maya's, Julian realized with a pang. They're frightened, Julian," Sister Agnes said, her voice soft yet firm. "The media, it's reached the children. They understand more than they let on." Julian felt a cold dread grip his heart. He stood, his expensive suit suddenly feeling like a suffocating cage. I need to see them," he stammered, his voice raspy. The drive to Hope's Haven felt agonizingly long. The city lights blurred into streaks of color, mirroring the turmoil within him. He arrived. His arrival met with hushed whispers and wary glances from the staff. He found Maya and Zara huddled together in the playroom, their usual bright eyes clouded with fear. The room, usually alive with the sounds of laughter and play, was eerily silent. Only the gentle ticking of an old grandfather clock punctuated the heavy silence. "Daddy," Maya whispered, her voice barely audible. The word hung in the air, fragile yet filled with a desperate hope that mirrored his own. He knelt, the worn carpet a stark contrast to the plush rugs of his mansion. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he touched Maya's cheek. Her skin was soft, her eyes mirroring his own fear. "I'm here," he managed, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm not going anywhere." Zara, usually the bolder twin, remained silent, her gaze fixed on the floor, her small hands clutching a worn doll. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, filled only with the unspoken fear and confusion. They say you abandoned us," Zara finally said, her voice cracking. The words, small and fragile, carried the weight of a lifetime of unspoken hurts. Julian felt a wave of nausea. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny, to explain, but the words caught in his throat. He couldn't offer platitudes, couldn't spin the truth. He could only offer the raw, unfiltered truth of his remorse. The weight of his past mistakes pressed down on him, a suffocating blanket of guilt and shame. This wasn't a publicity stunt anymore. This was a fight for his soul, and for the fragile hope blossoming in the wide, dark eyes of his daughters. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the Hope's Haven windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Julian sat awkwardly on a tiny, brightly colored chair, a stark contrast to the leather armchairs of his office. Maya and Zara, perched on a worn rug, played with building blocks, their movements hesitant. The air hummed with unspoken tension. He'd spent the night at a nearby hotel, unable to bear the thought of returning to his sterile mansion. The silence stretched, heavy with the weight of his past actions. "So," Julian began, his voice a low rumble, "school starts next week, right?" Maya, her braids bouncing slightly, nodded shyly. Zara, ever the pragmatist, remained focused on her blocks. Julian felt a surge of inadequacy. How did fathers do this? How did they bridge the gap between a life of privilege and the stark reality of Hope's Haven? He reached for a block, a bright red one, and built a wobbly tower beside Maya's. It's a good school, I hear," he mumbled, the words feeling clumsy and forced. "Sister Agnes says it is," Maya replied, her voice barely above a whisper. He noticed a flicker of something in her eyes. A guarded hope? A tentative trust? He spent the rest of the day observing them, a silent observer in their carefully constructed world. He watched Zara fiercely defend Maya during a game of tag, her protective instinct as sharp as attack. He saw Maya's quiet kindness as she shared her meager snacks with a younger child. They were survivors, these girls, their resilience a testament to the strength of their spirit. Later, while walking them back to their dormitory, Julian felt a hand slip into his. Maya's hand, small and surprisingly warm. He almost didn't dare to look down, afraid that the moment would shatter. But when he did, he saw a small smile, a genuine smile that touched his heart and warmed him in a way nothing else ever had. That night, alone in his hotel room, the weight of his actions pressed down on him. He opened his laptop, the harsh glare of the screen reflecting in his tired eyes. The negative press remained relentless, but something had shifted. It wasn't just about damage control anymore. It was about redemption, not just for his public image, but for his soul. He needed to be worthy of the small hand he held earlier. He needed to prove not just to the world, but to his daughters that he was capable of love. The fight had just begun. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air of Julian's temporary apartment, a stark contrast to the sweet, earthy smell of Hope's Haven. He stared at the meticulously arranged toys scattered across the floor, a silent testament to his clumsy attempts at connection. Maya, curled up on the sofa, absently traced patterns on a worn teddy bear. Zara, ever practical, was attempting to fix a broken doll, her brow furrowed in concentration. The silence was thick, punctuated only by the occasional sigh from Maya. I miss Sister Agnes," Maya finally whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning. Julian's heart ached. He'd envisioned grand gestures, lavish gifts, but the reality was far more complex, far more humbling. He knelt beside her, the plush carpet a welcome change from the polished marble floors of his mansion. "I know," he said softly, his voice rough with unshed tears, "but we can visit whenever you want, and I can learn to make pancakes like Sister Agnes." A small smile touched Maya's lips. It was a fragile thing, easily broken, but a start nonetheless. Zara looked up, her usually sharp gaze softened. "Pancakes are good," she agreed, her voice surprisingly gentle. The tension eased, replaced by a tentative sense of comfort. He saw it in their eyes, in the way they allowed him closer, not just physically but emotionally. Later that evening, Julian found himself reading aloud from Maya's favorite book, a tattered copy of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. His voice, usually commanding and assured, was hesitant and unsure, but the girls seemed to appreciate the effort. He felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling entirely alien yet profoundly comforting. He was becoming a father, not in the grand, sweeping gestures he had initially imagined, but in the small, quiet moments of connection. The fight was far from over, the public backlash still looming, but in the shared laughter, in the comforting weight of Maya's head resting against his shoulder, he found a strength he never knew he possessed. He had a long way to go, but he was finally on the path. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the gauzy curtains of Maya and Zara's shared room at Hope's Haven, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Julian, awkwardly perched on a small wooden chair, watched them eat breakfast bowls of simple oatmeal, a stark contrast to the gourmet meals of his usual life. The quiet hum of the orphanage was a soothing balm to his frayed nerves. The pancakes at Hope's Haven, they're different, Zara observed, her voice quiet but perceptive. She eyed Julian, her expression unreadable. Julian swallowed, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. Yes, well, Sister Agnes has a special recipe, I imagine. He forced a smile, feeling the weight of his past actions pressing down on him. Maya, usually reserved, looked up from her bowl. She uses real maple syrup, she said, a wistful note in her voice. The simplicity of the statement cut through him like a knife. He'd spent his life surrounded by luxury, yet the simplest things, real maple syrup, a warm embrace, seemed so foreign to him. He reached out, his hand hovering over Maya's. She didn't flinch away. The contact, brief but profound, sent a jolt of warmth through him. Later that day, a social worker arrived, her face etched with a mixture of concern and professional detachment. The media frenzy was escalating. The whispers, the speculation, the accusations, all were aimed at Julian, painting him as a heartless tycoon exploiting vulnerable children for a publicity stunt. Mr. Thorne, she began, her voice careful. We need to discuss the potential legal ramifications of this situation. The orphanage could face severe scrutiny. The chilling possibility hit Julian with the force of a physical blow. He had selfishly intruded into their lives, and now his actions risked dismantling the very haven that had protected Maya and Zara for so long. The weight of his responsibility crashed down on him, heavy and inescapable. His carefully constructed world, built on wealth and public image, was crumbling. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about protecting these two innocent girls, his daughters, from the storm he had unwittingly unleashed. He had to act, and he had to act fast. The fight for his reputation was secondary. The fight for his family had just begun. The following week blurred into a series of awkward, tentative steps. Julian found himself drawn to the simple rhythm of Hope's Haven. The scent of freshly laundered clothes, the echoing laughter of children playing in the courtyard, the gentle hum of Sister Agnes's voice. It was a world away from his sterile, opulent mansion. He started small. He helped Sister Agnes with gardening, his clumsy hands surprisingly adept at weeding the flower beds. He read bedtime stories to Maya and Zara, his voice initially stiff and formal, slowly softening as he became lost in the tales. He learned Maya preferred fairy tales, while Zara devoured adventure stories. One afternoon, he found Zara sketching in a worn notebook, her brow furrowed in concentration. He knelt beside her, the rough ground surprisingly comfortable against his tailored trousers. "What are you drawing?" he asked softly. Zara looked up, startled. "A dragon," she whispered, showing him a page filled with intricate details, a creature both fearsome and beautiful. "It's for a contest," she added shyly. Julian felt a surge of warmth. He wasn't used to this intimacy, this quiet sharing of a creative spark. "It's amazing," he murmured, genuinely impressed. He didn't know what to say to bridge the vast chasm between his world and hers, but the shared silence felt comfortable, a fragile bond beginning to form. Later, as he watched Maya meticulously arrange pebbles in the courtyard, a surprisingly calming activity, He felt a shift within himself. The fear and guilt still lingered, the shadow of his past mistakes ever present. But a new feeling was emerging, a quiet, tentative hope, intertwined with the burgeoning love for his daughters. He was learning patience, learning to truly see them, not as a public relations project, but as individuals deserving of love, understanding, and a father's unwavering support. The fight for his reputation remained, a looming storm cloud on the horizon, but for now, the gentle warmth of the setting sun on his face, the quiet sounds of the orphanage, and the shared moments of connection with his daughters felt more precious than any wealth he possessed. The media circus was still raging, but in this small, quiet haven, a new family was taking root. The sterile, clinical environment of the therapist's office felt a world away from the comforting chaos of Hope's Haven. Julian sat stiffly, the plush leather of the armchair doing little to ease the tension coiling in his gut. Dr. Eris, a woman with kind eyes and a gentle voice, offered him a glass of water. He declined, his throat too tight. "It's difficult," he began, his voice a low rumble. "This fatherhood thing." Dr. Eris nodded, her expression encouraging. "Tell me about it. What feels difficult?" He hesitated, the weight of years of emotional repression pressing down. I don't know how. I've never known how to connect with anyone." The words felt raw, a confession he hadn't realized he was ready to make. He thought of his own cold, distant father, a ghost in his memory. The pattern he now saw was tragically clear. "The girls, they're so different," he continued, his voice cracking slightly. "Their world is so small, simple. Mine is vast, overwhelming. How do I bridge that gap?" He rubbed his temples, the faint scent of expensive cologne doing nothing to mask the underlying anxiety. Dr. Eris listened patiently, her gaze unwavering. "It's a significant difference, Julian, but it's not insurmountable. It will take time, patience, and a willingness to learn. To unlearn, perhaps," she added softly, her words finding a resonant chord within him. He closed his eyes, visualizing Maya's shy smile, Zara's fierce determination. The image brought a pang of guilt. He'd spent a lifetime building walls around his heart, but these two tiny girls had somehow breached them. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. I want to be a good father," he whispered, the words a fragile prayer. "But I don't know where to begin." Dr. Eris smiled gently. "We'll start with understanding your past, Julian. Understanding the patterns that led you here. Then we'll focus on building new ones. Healthy ones." The sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a silent testament to the passage of time and the possibility of a new beginning. The road ahead was long, arduous, filled with challenges he couldn't yet foresee. But for the first time in a long time, Julian felt a flicker of hope, fragile yet persistent. He was finally ready to confront his demons, not for his public image, but for the two little girls who had unwittingly become his salvation. The aroma of freshly baked bread, a comforting contrast to the sterile scent of the therapist's office, hung in the air as Julian walked back to Hope's Haven. He felt lighter, strangely so, after his session with Dr. Eris. The weight of his past, though still heavy, felt less suffocating. He saw Maya tending the garden, her small hands carefully coaxing life from the soil. The afternoon sun warmed her dark curls, casting a gentle glow on her face. "Hi, Daddy," she murmured, her voice barely audible above the buzzing of bees. The word, Daddy, still felt foreign, yet strangely comforting. Julian knelt beside her, the rough soil clinging to his expensive trousers. "Hello, sweetheart," he replied, his voice softer than he intended. He felt a lump forming in his throat. He wasn't used to such vulnerability, to such raw emotion. He reached out, gently touching a stray curl. Maya didn't flinch, instead offering a small, hesitant smile. Zara burst from the orphanage, her usual boisterous energy slightly subdued. "He's back," she announced to the other children, her eyes shining with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "Daddy's back." The other children, sensing the significance of the moment, fell silent. Julian felt a surge of warmth towards these children, towards this place that had unwittingly become his family's refuge. He stood, offering a reassuring smile to Zara. "I'm here," he said, his voice steady, filled with a newfound assurance he hadn't known he possessed. Later, in the orphanage's common room, the twins sat beside him, a picture of quiet contemplation. He attempted to initiate a conversation about school, about their interests, about their dreams, his clumsy attempts at connection becoming increasingly natural. He listened intently as Maya talked about her love for books and Zara's passionate declarations of her wish to become a doctor, her small hands mimicking the movements of a surgeon. He shared his stories of his travels, of the incredible places he'd been, tempering it with his newfound awareness of the importance of shared experiences. The evening drew closer, casting long shadows across the room. A sense of peace permeated the air, a profound contrast to the turmoil of the past few weeks. Julian watched the twins, their faces softly illuminated by the warm glow of the lamplight, their presence a powerful antidote to the loneliness that had plagued him for so long. For the first time in a very long time, he felt a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose. He was home, the therapist's office, smelling faintly of lavender and old paper, felt a world away from the earthy scent of Hope's Haven. Julian traced the rim of his coffee cup, the warmth a small comfort against the chill that lingered in his heart. He'd confessed his fears to Dr. Eris, the fear of failure, the fear of ruining their lives, the crippling fear of exposing his inadequacies. "They deserve better than me," he'd whispered, his voice cracking. Dr. Eris had simply nodded, her gaze steady and understanding. "They deserve a chance," she'd corrected gently. "And you, Julian, deserve a chance to give it to them." The drive back was filled with a quiet intensity. The city lights blurred into streaks of color, a kaleidoscope reflecting the turmoil within him. He parked, the familiar sight of the orphanage a welcome anchor in the storm of his emotions. He saw Maya, perched on a low wall, a worn book open in her lap. The setting sun painted her skin in hues of gold and rose. He approached slowly, his heart pounding a hesitant rhythm against his ribs. "Maya," he began, his voice rougher than he intended. She looked up, her eyes, the same dark pools as her sister's, wide with surprise. "Daddy," she breathed, the word still tentative, still fragile. He knelt beside her, feeling the rough texture of the stone beneath his hands. He reached out, his fingers brushing a stray curl, a gesture as hesitant as his words. I was thinking about what you said about wanting to go to the city library." A slow smile spread across her face, a blossoming flower pushing through the hard soil of her apprehension. "It has more books," she said softly. "Real old books." Zara appeared then, her usual whirlwind of energy tempered by a quiet observation. "He's trying," she whispered to herself, her words barely audible. He felt a pang of something akin to pride. They were seeing his effort, even amidst the uncertainty. The evening was filled with a quiet intimacy, a shared silence punctuated by the gentle sounds of the orphanage, the creak of a floorboard, the rustle of turning pages, the distant laughter of other children. He read to them, his voice catching on occasion, his usual eloquence lost in a newfound vulnerability. He felt, for the first time in his life, truly seen. And for the first time, he felt truly himself. The journey was far from over, but in the shared warmth of that simple evening, he glimpsed a future worth fighting for. The sterile scent of antiseptic and the muted hum of the air conditioning in Dr. Eris' office still clung to Julian's clothes. He'd confessed his deepest fears, the raw vulnerability leaving him drained yet strangely lighter. The drive back was a blur, the city lights smearing into a kaleidoscope of anxiety and hope. He parked, the familiar, comforting sight of Hope's Haven, a stark contrast to the opulent sterility of his own life. Maya sat on the low wall, sunlight catching the gold in her dark hair, a worn book resting in her lap. He approached slowly, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. "Maya," he began, his voice rough with emotion, Her surprise quickly yielded to a hesitant smile. "Daddy," she breathed, the word fragile tentative. He knelt, the cold stone a grounding presence against his trembling hands. He gently brushed a stray curl from her forehead, the simple gesture brimming with unspoken affection. I was thinking about what you said, about wanting to go to the city library." A slow smile bloomed on her face, a fragile flower pushing through hardened earth. "It has more books," she whispered. "Real old books." Zara appeared, her usual energy tempered, her eyes keenly observing. "He's trying," she murmured, almost to herself, a quiet observation that resonated with a surprising depth. He felt a surge of something akin to pride, a tiny seed of hope taking root. That evening, the orphanage hummed with its usual gentle rhythm, the creak of floorboards, the rustle of pages, the distant laughter of children. He read to them, his voice occasionally catching, his usual eloquence lost in a newfound vulnerability. He read of faraway lands, of brave knights and magical creatures, his words infused with a newfound sincerity. He wasn't just reading words. He was sharing a part of himself, a part he hadn't known existed. He felt, for the first time, truly seen, truly known, not as Julian Thorne, the millionaire, but as Julian, a father. The journey was far from over, but in the shared warmth of that simple evening, he saw a future worth fighting for, a future filled with the quiet promise of love and belonging. The city lights still blurred, but now they held a glimmer of warmth, reflecting the quiet revolution unfolding within him. The sprawling Thorne mansion felt alien, a gilded cage compared to Hope's Haven's comforting simplicity. Maya and Zara, perched on the edge of a plush velvet sofa, stared wide-eyed at the towering atrium. Sunlight streamed through the glass ceiling, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a stark contrast to the orphanage's soft, filtered light. Julian watched them, a knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. "It's a lot," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. He felt the weight of his past failures pressing down on him. Zara, ever the pragmatist, spoke first. "It's bigger than the whole orphanage." Her voice was small, tinged with a hint of awe, but her eyes held a flicker of apprehension. Maya, quieter, more observant, simply nodded, her gaze lingering on a shimmering crystal chandelier. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken anxieties. Julian felt the familiar sting of guilt. He'd built this empire, this monument to success, yet it felt hollow, inadequate in the face of his daughter's quiet apprehension. "I know it's different," he said, kneeling before them, his voice softer this time, "but we can make it our own. We can find ways to make it feel like home. What do you think?" He saw a flicker of hesitation in Maya's eyes, a silent battle between curiosity and fear. Zara, however, surprised him. A small smile played on her lips. "We could have our own library," she said, her eyes lighting up. "A real one with all the books we want." The simple suggestion resonated deep within Julian. It wasn't about the grandeur of the mansion, but about creating a space where they felt safe, loved, and understood. The weight on his chest eased slightly. Hope, fragile yet persistent, began to bloom. He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, a stark contrast to the practiced smiles of his public persona. "A library," he repeated, the words tasting sweet on his tongue. "We can definitely have a library." The transition was not immediate. The girl's initial excitement faded, replaced by a quiet apprehension. The vastness of the house, the endless corridors and opulent rooms, began to feel overwhelming. The next few days were a delicate dance between eagerness and fear, between Julian's well-intentioned efforts and the sisters' hesitant steps into this new world. He learned that integration, true integration, would require more than just material comforts. It needed patience, understanding, and a willingness to adapt to their rhythm, not force them into his. The journey, he realized, was just beginning. The aroma of freshly baked cookies, a stark contrast to the usual sterile scent of the mansion, filled the air. Maya, perched on a stool at the kitchen island, meticulously frosted a cupcake, her brow furrowed in concentration. Zara, sprawled on the floor amidst a scattering of building blocks, hummed a tuneless melody. Julian watched them, a quiet observer in this newly established domestic scene. He'd hired a chef, a nanny, and a tutor, but the orchestrated perfection felt hollow, a jarring dissonance to the comforting chaos he'd witnessed at Hope's Haven. "They're beautiful," he murmured, more to himself than to the girls. Maya glanced up, her small hand pausing mid-frosting. "The cupcakes?" she asked, a tentative smile gracing her lips. "No, you both are," Julian corrected gently. The words felt clumsy, inadequate, a poor substitute for the unspoken emotions swirling within him. Zara, oblivious, continued to build her tower, her lips moving silently as she concentrated. The sound of her quiet humming, however, was strangely comforting. It anchored him to the present moment, a reminder of the fragile peace he was desperately trying to build. That evening, as Julian tucked them into their meticulously appointed bedrooms, each designed to feel as safe and familiar as their orphanage rooms, Maya spoke. Her voice, barely a whisper, cut through the silence. "Thank you," she said, her eyes fixed on the plush teddy bear she clutched. The simple word, laden with unspoken gratitude and a hint of apprehension, sent a wave of emotion through Julian. He knelt beside her bed, the plush carpet soft beneath his knees. He reached out, his touch hesitant, and gently stroked her hair. "For what, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "For trying," she whispered, then closed her eyes. The unspoken words hung heavy in the air. For trying to be a father. For trying to make amends. For trying to build a family from the ashes of his past mistakes. The weight of his past still pressed down on him, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope, a tiny spark igniting within the darkness. The journey towards healing was long, filled with uncertainty and potential pitfalls, but in this quiet moment, shared in the warmth of his daughter's presence, he knew he was on the right path. The mansion still felt foreign, a vast and intimidating space, but with every shared laugh, every quiet moment, it slowly, painstakingly, began to feel like home. The sprawling Thorn mansion felt less like a home and more like a gilded cage. Sunlight, fractured by the stained glass windows, cast kaleidoscopic patterns across the polished marble floors. Maya and Zara, perched awkwardly on the plush velvet sofa, felt the plushness as a stark contrast to the worn, familiar comfort of their orphanage cots. The air, scented with expensive potpourri, felt suffocating. "It's nice," Zara whispered, her eyes darting around the immense room. Her voice, usually bright and chirpy, was subdued. Maya nodded, her gaze fixed on a tiny, intricate carving on the armrest. Silence settled between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Julian, watching from the doorway, felt a familiar pang of guilt. He'd envisioned grand gestures, a seamless transition into this opulent world. Instead, he was confronted by their silent apprehension, their quiet discomfort. He wanted to bridge the gap, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. He crossed the room, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the vast space. He knelt beside them, his expensive suit feeling strangely out of place. I know this is a lot," he began, his voice hesitant. "It's different from Hope's Haven." Maya finally looked up, her eyes, usually sparkling with mischief, were clouded with a sadness that pierced Julian's heart. "It's big," she said softly, a hint of a tremor in her voice. The simple word encapsulated the vast chasm between their old life and this new, unfamiliar reality. Zara, ever the pragmatist, added, "And quiet, too quiet." The silence, indeed, felt oppressive. At Hope's Haven, even quiet moments held a comforting hum of shared lives. Here, it was only the echoing grandeur of the mansion. Julian felt a wave of self-recrimination wash over him. He'd focused on providing for them materially, neglecting the emotional needs that he now realized were far more important. He had to build more than just a home. He had to build a family. He had to earn their trust. He reached out, his hand hovering over Maya's before gently touching her shoulder. "We can change that," he said, his voice filled with a newfound determination. "We can make it less quiet, more us." The words felt inadequate, but they carried a sincerity that he hoped they could sense. He saw a flicker of hope in Maya's eyes, a tiny spark in the pervasive gloom of uncertainty. It wasn't a complete shift, but it was a start, a fragile, tentative beginning in a long journey of healing. The mansion, though still intimidating, felt marginally less like a cage and marginally more like a possibility. The work was just beginning. The following week was a blur of meetings with educators, tutors, and therapists. Julian, surrounded by the sterile scent of antiseptic and the hushed tones of professionals, felt utterly out of his depth. He'd envisioned private tutors in sprawling libraries, not this clinical atmosphere. He watched Maya and Zara, their faces mirroring his own unease, their usual vibrant energy dimmed by the unfamiliar environment. "It's a lot," Zara murmured, her voice barely above a whisper as they sat in the waiting room. The antiseptic smell a stark contrast to the familiar scent of wood smoke and disinfectant from Hope's Haven. Maya nodded, clutching a worn, well-loved teddy bear. The therapist, a kind woman with warm eyes and a gentle smile, suggested a gradual integration. "We don't want to overwhelm them," she explained, her voice calm and reassuring. "Let's focus on building trust and comfort before introducing them to a completely different lifestyle." Julian felt a wave of relief. He'd been so focused on providing the best, the most extravagant, that he'd overlooked the most crucial element, a gentle transition. He'd been blinded by his guilt, his desperate need to atone, overlooking the girl's needs. That evening, back in the mansion's quieter, less formal wing, a space Julian had designated as their space, he found Maya sketching in a notebook, her brow furrowed in concentration. Zara was reading a tattered copy of Alice in Wonderland, her usual bright smile playing on her lips. "How was it?" he asked softly, sitting on the floor beside Maya, careful not to intrude on her concentration. Maya looked up, her eyes hesitant. "It was okay," she said, her voice small. "It's just different." "I know," Julian replied, his voice thick with emotion. "And I'm sorry if it's been overwhelming." He paused, searching for the right words. "I want you both to know that you're not obligated to do anything you're not comfortable with. Hope's Haven is still your home. This is just an addition." Zara looked up from her book, her expression thoughtful. "We like Hope's Haven," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But it's nice to have a different place too." Julian's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and hope. He leaned against the wall, the cool stone a comfort against his back. The vast, echoing space felt less daunting now, filled with the quiet presence of his daughters, the gentle rustle of pages, and the soft scratch of pencil on paper. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start, a hesitant, tentative step towards building something real, something enduring, something more precious than any gilded cage. The relentless glare of the paparazzi's flashbulbs felt like a physical assault. Julian shielded Maya and Zara as they hurried through the throng, the cacophony of shouting reporters a jarring contrast to the quiet sanctuary of Hope's Haven. The air hung thick with the smell of exhaust fumes and cheap perfume, a far cry from the crisp scent of pine that permeated the orphanage grounds. "It's okay," Julian murmured, his voice strained, feeling the weight of their fear mirrored in his own rising panic. He could see the tremor in Zara's hand as she clutched his. Maya, usually so observant, seemed lost in the chaos, her gaze fixed on the ground. That evening, nestled in their space, Julian attempted a casual conversation. "So," he began, his voice tentative, "how was your adventure?" Maya shrugged, her eyes downcast. "It was loud," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fireplace. Zara, ever the pragmatist, added, "People kept asking if we were actors." A faint smile touched her lips, a flicker of amusement amidst the lingering unease. "They were just curious," Julian reassured them, though the words felt hollow even to his own ears. He knew the curiosity was fueled by more than simple inquisitiveness. It was a hunger for scandal, a morbid fascination with his fall from grace. He saw the apprehension in their eyes, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Will this always be like this? The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't just brought them into his world. He'd thrust them into the eye of a media storm. The luxurious mansion, initially meant as a haven, now felt like a gilded cage. He looked at his daughters, their faces etched with a mixture of awe and fear. The weight of his responsibility pressed down on him. This wasn't about atoning for his past. It was about building a future where his daughters felt safe, loved, and unconditionally accepted, even amidst the turmoil of public scrutiny. The next morning, he made a decision, one that sent a tremor through the carefully constructed facade of his public persona. He was going to be honest. He would face the music, protect his daughters, and finally, truly, be their father. The mahogany table, polished to a mirror sheen, felt alien beneath Maya's small hands. The afternoon sun, streaming through the arched windows of Julian's dining room, illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, a stark contrast to the Spartan simplicity of Hope's Haven. Zara, ever practical, meticulously dissected a miniature croissant, her brow furrowed in concentration. Julian watched them, a familiar ache tightening in his chest. "It's different here," Maya finally said, her voice barely a whisper, more to herself than to him. The opulent room, with its shimmering silverware and crystal glasses, felt like a mausoleum compared to the vibrant chaos of the orphanage's common room. "I know," Julian replied, his voice rough. He reached for a napkin, his hand trembling slightly. I didn't think about how it would be for you." He felt the weight of his past mistakes pressing down on him, a crushing burden. Zara looked up, her dark eyes assessing him with a maturity beyond her years. "It's nice," she conceded, "but it's not home." The words hung in the air, sharp and clear, a painful reminder of the chasm he was trying to bridge. A wave of guilt washed over him. He had envisioned a smooth transition, a seamless integration into his world. The reality was far more complex, a delicate dance of adapting to their needs, their fears, their quiet resilience. He couldn't force them to accept him. He had to earn their trust, their love. The luxury surrounding them felt suddenly hollow, a stark reminder of the emptiness he had carried for so long. He pushed his chair back from the table, the polished wood creaking softly under his weight. "Perhaps," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion, "we could make it feel more like home?" The question hung in the air, a tentative step toward a future he desperately hoped to build. The sunlight, once a symbol of his wealth, now illuminated the daunting task ahead, a journey of redemption paved with genuine connection, not just grand gestures. The path to his daughters' hearts would be slow, painstaking, but he was ready to walk it. Every step, every shared moment would be a step toward building something real, something lasting, something that transcended the glitz and the glamour. The following week blurred into a whirlwind of therapists' appointments and frantic phone calls. Julian, stripped bare of his usual armor of self-assurance, revealed his vulnerabilities to Dr. Anya Sharma, a woman whose calm, perceptive gaze saw past his carefully constructed facade. He confessed his past mistakes, the casual cruelty of his youth, the crippling fear of intimacy that had driven him away from their mother. The scent of chamomile tea, ever present in Dr. Sharma's office, offered a small comfort amidst the storm raging inside him. He found himself drawn to the quiet sanctuary of Hope's Haven, the scent of disinfectant and old books a comforting contrast to the sterile opulence of his own home. He watched Maya and Zara, their laughter echoing in the dimly lit hallways, a sound he now cherished more than any accolade. He sat with them, reading aloud from their favorite books, the rough texture of the worn pages grounding him in the present, reminding him of a life lived outside the gilded cage of his wealth. One evening, while helping Maya with her homework, he caught a glimpse of her drawing. It was a vibrant depiction of Hope's Haven, filled with swirling colors and expressive lines. A tiny figure, clearly representing her, stood at the heart of the drawing, her face upturned, filled with hope. He felt a lump forming in his throat. "It's beautiful," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Maya looked up, her dark eyes shining. "It's our home," she whispered, a simple statement that held the weight of worlds. The ornate grandeur of his mansion suddenly felt insignificant, irrelevant, compared to the genuine warmth he felt in this small, unassuming place. The next day brought a new challenge. He attempted to gently suggest private tutoring for the girls, a carefully planned foray into a more enriching educational experience. Zara, ever the pragmatist, immediately raised concerns. "We don't want to leave Hope's Haven," she stated, her voice firm yet laced with a hint of vulnerability. "It's where we belong." Julian saw the fear in her eyes, the quiet fear of disruption, of change. He realized he had been so focused on his own redemption that he had overlooked their needs, their comfort. He had underestimated the resilience of their bond with the orphanage. The weight of his past mistakes pressed down on him anew. He needed to proceed with sensitivity, with a deep understanding of their world and their feelings. The opulent mansion, once a sanctuary, now felt like an impenetrable fortress. He had a long way to go. The crisp autumn air nipped at Julian's cheeks as he walked the grounds of Hope's Haven. The scent of damp earth and decaying leaves a stark contrast to the manicured lawns of his estate. He watched Maya and Zara playing hopscotch, their laughter a fragile melody against the backdrop of rustling leaves. He ached with a longing he'd never known, a desperate need to bridge the chasm between his world and theirs. He knelt beside them, the rough ground a jarring shift from the plush carpets of his home. "That's a good jump, Maya," he said, his voice still stiff, still echoing with the ghost of his former self. Maya, ever observant, tilted her head. "You're good at hopscotch too, Mr. Thorne," she said, a hint of surprise in her voice. Zara, more reserved, simply nodded, her eyes studying him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. He saw a flicker of something resembling trust in their glances, a tiny spark in the vast darkness of his past regrets. Later, in the orphanage's small, sun-drenched common room, Julian attempted to help them with their homework. The air was thick with the scent of old books and slightly burnt popcorn from a previous snack time. His clumsy attempts at explaining fractions were met with polite patience, their quiet concentration a gentle balm to his guilt. He felt a profound sense of inadequacy, a stark awareness of his inability to fully comprehend their world, their needs. "It's different from my school," Maya said quietly, her gaze fixed on her worksheet. The simple statement struck a chord, a revelation of a subtle yet significant difference in their experiences. "Yes, it is," Julian responded softly, his voice thick with emotion. The weight of his responsibility settled upon him, a heavy cloak of obligation and remorse. He understood now that bridging the gap wouldn't just be about providing financial support. It would involve a complete transformation of his being. He needed to learn their language, their rhythms, to earn their trust, not just as their father, but as a friend. The journey had only just begun. The scent of freshly baked bread mingled with the faint aroma of wood smoke from the orphanage's aging chimney. Sunlight streamed through the dusty windows of the small kitchen, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the golden rays. Julian, sleeves rolled up, awkwardly kneaded dough beside Maya, her small hands surprisingly strong as she helped him shape the bread rolls. Zara, perched on a stool, watched them with quiet intensity, her dark eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight on the table. "Like this, Papa," Maya instructed, her voice a soft whisper, her brow furrowed in concentration as she demonstrated the proper shaping technique. Julian chuckled, a genuine sound that surprised even him. He'd never imagined himself in this domestic scene, flour dusting his already rumpled shirt. "You're a natural," he said, his voice thick with a warmth he was only beginning to understand. Zara, finally speaking, added, "Better than your pancakes, Papa." Her tone was teasing, yet a hint of affection colored her words. Julian felt a warmth spread through him. He glanced at Zara, catching a fleeting smile. That evening, after a simple dinner of the rolls they'd baked together, The three sat huddled in the orphanage's cozy common room. The crackling fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating a sense of intimacy and comfort. Julian read aloud from a worn copy of Alice in Wonderland. His voice, once cold and distant, now soft and expressive. Maya and Zara, initially hesitant, gradually leaned closer, their laughter punctuating the fantastical tale. As the story ended, a comfortable silence settled over them. Julian, watching the twins' faces illuminated by the firelight, felt a deep well of emotion well up within him. He was not just a wealthy benefactor but a father. Imperfect, clumsy, and still learning, but undeniably present. The path ahead remained daunting, a path littered with challenges both personal and public. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a profound sense of purpose and belonging. He knew the journey to healing would be long and arduous, but sitting there, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the innocent joy of his daughters, he felt a sense of hope that was both fragile and profoundly powerful. The following weeks blurred into a whirlwind of activity. Julian, surprisingly adept at assembling flat-pack furniture, helped build a new playset in the orphanage garden, the scent of pine and freshly turned earth filling the air. He learned to braid Maya's hair, his clumsy fingers fumbling at first, then gaining a surprising dexterity. Zara, initially reserved, began to show him her intricate drawings, her quiet pride evident in her shy smile. The laughter echoing through the garden was a stark contrast to the hushed silence of his opulent mansion. One evening, while sharing a simple pizza dinner in the orphanage's common room, Maya tentatively asked, "Papa, will we ever live with you?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken anxieties. Julian hesitated, the casual ease he'd cultivated slipping away. He looked at Zara, whose eyes mirrored Maya's apprehension. "That's something we need to talk about," he began, his voice catching slightly. "It's not as simple as just moving you both." The truth was, he was terrified. The thought of disrupting their lives, uprooting them from the only home they'd ever known, filled him with guilt. He saw the flicker of disappointment in their eyes, the subtle shrinking of their shoulders, and his heart ached. "But we want to," Maya whispered, her voice barely audible. Zara nodded, her gaze fixed on her plate. He reached across the table, his hand gently covering Maya's. "I understand," he said softly, his voice raw with emotion. "And I want that too. But we need to do this carefully, at a pace that feels right for all of us. We need to find a way to bridge the gap between your world and mine, to build a life where you feel safe, loved, and home." The warmth of his touch, the sincerity in his voice, finally seemed to reach them. A glimmer of hope, fragile yet bright, shone in their eyes. The pizza, half-eaten, lay forgotten between them, overshadowed by the unspoken promises hanging in the air. The flickering candlelight illuminated their faces, painting their features in soft shadows. This was more than just a publicity stunt gone wrong. It was a journey into uncharted emotional territory, a path towards healing that was both daunting and profoundly rewarding. The following weeks were a delicate dance of adjustment. Julian, armed with newly purchased children's books and a surprisingly deft hand at braiding, found himself captivated by the twins' distinct personalities. Maya, the bolder of the two, peppered him with questions about his life, her curiosity a sharp contrast to Zara's quiet observation. The scent of freshly baked cookies, a new addition to their evening routine, mingled with the comforting aroma of wood smoke from the orphanage fireplace. He learned that Maya adored horses, a passion that sparked an impromptu trip to a nearby stable, the sunlight warming their faces as they watched a chestnut mare gallop across the field. One evening, nestled amongst the worn cushions of the orphanage's common room, Zara hesitantly showed Julian a sketch, a breathtakingly detailed drawing of a phoenix rising from flames. "It's about starting over," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. Her eyes, usually guarded, held a vulnerability that tugged at his heart. He saw a reflection of his own journey in her art, a phoenix rising from the ashes of his past mistakes. "It's beautiful, Zara," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. He felt a pang of guilt. The opulence of his life felt jarringly out of place against the simple beauty of her drawing. The worn rug beneath their feet, the comforting warmth of the fire. The chasm between their worlds was vast, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope that it could be bridged. "Papa," Maya began, her voice hesitant. "The other kids, they ask questions." Her gaze dropped to her hands, twisting a loose thread on her worn jeans. The casual ease he'd cultivated faltered. He knew this was the conversation they needed to have about his public life, the media's scrutiny, and the impact it had on the girls. He swallowed, the lump in his throat constricting his breathing. "And how do you feel about it?" he asked softly, wanting to understand her perspective, her anxieties. Zara, ever the observer, spoke quietly, her voice soft yet clear. "It's confusing," she confessed. "But it's okay. You're trying." Her words, simple yet profound, were a balm to his soul. Their acceptance, however tentative, was the greatest gift he could have asked for. He was far from perfect, but their quiet trust was a beacon guiding him through this uncharted emotional landscape. He knew the journey was far from over, but for the first time he saw a path towards a future where they could truly be a family. He saw a future where the scent of pine and freshly turned earth would be forever interwoven with the warmth of their laughter. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee, a stark contrast to the usually faint scent of antiseptic, filled the small kitchen of Julian's sprawling estate. He stood awkwardly, a spatula clutched in his hand, attempting to flip pancakes. The batter splattered, mirroring the chaotic state of his emotions. Maya, perched on a stool, watched with amusement, her dark eyes twinkling. "Need some help, Papa?" she offered, her voice soft but laced with a teasing undertone. Julian managed a strained smile. No, I've got this," he mumbled, his concentration wavering. The pancakes burned. He sighed, placing the spatula down with a clatter. "Okay, maybe I need some help." He felt a pang of inadequacy. This simple task, a cornerstone of ordinary family life, felt monumental. Zara, ever the observer, entered the kitchen, her quiet presence a calming influence. "I can make the fruit salad," she said, her voice a quiet melody. Her hands, small and deft, moved with practiced ease as she prepared the fruit. The air filled with the sweet scent of berries and mangoes, a momentary peace settling over the kitchen. The clanging of a dropped spoon broke the quiet. Maya burst into laughter. "Sorry," she said, wiping a tear from her eye. The sound of her laughter, light and carefree, was a melody Julian longed to hear often. It was a stark contrast to the strained silence that had pervaded his life for so long. The breakfast table was a scene of gentle chaos. Syrup dribbled, jokes were shared, and the quiet clinking of cutlery blended with soft chatter. The casual intimacy felt almost fragile, a tender bud blooming in the harsh winter of his past. But amidst the laughter and spilled juice, Julian felt a profound sense of peace. The pancakes may have been burned, but he was finally making his way toward becoming a father, a journey of redemption, pancake by burnt pancake. This was the beginning, not of a perfect family, but of a real one, imperfect and undeniably beautiful. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of Julian's study, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden light. Maya sat perched on a plush armchair, nervously twisting a lock of her dark hair. Zara, ever the observer, sat quietly beside her, a worn copy of Little Women resting on her lap. The air hung heavy with unspoken emotions. "It's different," Maya finally said, her voice barely a whisper. The words hung in the air, heavy with a mixture of apprehension and wonder. She glanced at Julian, who sat across from them, his usual polished composure replaced by a tentative gentleness. Julian nodded, his gaze softening. "I know it is, sweetheart. A big change." He reached out, his hand hovering over Maya's before settling gently on her arm. The touch, surprisingly tender, eased some of her apprehension. Zara looked up from her book, her eyes reflecting the sunlight. "It's not just the house," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's everything. The weight of their adjustment settled on her shoulders. Leaving Hope's Haven was more than just a change of address. It meant leaving a familiar rhythm, a safety net woven from shared experiences and supportive staff. Julian felt a pang of guilt. He tried to ease the transition, to create a comfortable environment mimicking their previous life, but he knew it was far from successful. The vastness of his home, the opulent furnishings, the quiet, sterile elegance, it all felt alien to them. "I understand," he said, his voice low, "and I'm sorry if I haven't made it easier. I'm learning," he added, a hint of self-deprecation in his tone. He looked at each of them in turn, his eyes searching for understanding. "This is new for all of us. I want to make this right. I want to be a good father." The words felt clumsy, inadequate, yet they held a genuine sincerity that both girls seemed to sense. Maya met his gaze, her dark eyes searching his. "It's just so much," she confessed, a hint of tears glistening in her eyes. The fear and uncertainty she had suppressed was finally surfacing. Zara reached out and took Maya's hand, a silent gesture of support. The bond between the twins, so apparent, was a powerful anchor in their newfound world. The silence that followed wasn't strained. It held the space for unspoken emotions, for a shared understanding that transcended words. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the room. As the three of them sat in companionable silence, each grappling with the complex reality of their newly formed family, the aroma of freshly baked bread wafted from the kitchen, a comforting scent in the otherwise formal dining room. Maya, picking at her food, avoided Julian's gaze. Zara, however, ate with a quiet grace, her eyes occasionally meeting her father's. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken anxieties. "It's nice," Maya finally mumbled, pushing her plate away. The words felt forced, a fragile attempt to bridge the chasm between them. Julian's heart ached. He saw the guardedness in her eyes, the subtle withdrawal. He tried so hard to create a comfortable space, but the opulent surroundings seemed to amplify their discomfort, a stark contrast to the simple warmth of Hope's Haven. "I know it's different," he said softly, his voice gentle. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. The touch was hesitant, respectful of her boundaries. "But we can make it better. Tell me what you need, Maya. What would make this feel more like home?" A single tear traced a path down Maya's cheek. Zara reached across, her hand enveloping Maya's. The unspoken comfort between the twins was a powerful testament to their bond. "It's not just the house, Daddy," Zara said, her voice surprisingly steady. "It's everything. It's learning to trust, letting go of what we knew." She looked at Julian, her gaze direct and clear. "It takes time." Julian nodded, understanding dawning on him. He'd focused on the physical, the tangible aspects of their new life, neglecting the emotional landscape they were navigating. He hadn't considered the upheaval, the wrench of leaving their familiar world. The weight of his past actions pressed down on him, a heavy cloak of guilt. He'd created this distance, this chasm, but he was determined to bridge it, one careful step at a time. He squeezed Maya's hand, a silent promise of unwavering support. "I understand," he whispered, "and I will be patient. We'll do this together, whatever it takes." He met Zara's gaze, his eyes brimming with genuine remorse and determination. The unspoken vow hung in the air, a fragile bridge built on trust and a shared desire for healing. The clinking of silverware against china faded into the background, replaced by the quiet hum of a tentative hope, a nascent sense of family. The following weeks were a blur of hesitant steps and awkward silences. Julian, armed with parenting books and a well-meaning but often clumsy approach, attempted to integrate himself into the girls' lives. He'd arranged for a tutor, a sleek, modern addition to their simple routine at Hope's Haven, jarring against the worn wooden floors and hand-me-down toys. The girls, however, remained distant, their smiles fleeting, their eyes guarded. One Saturday, Julian bundled them into his chauffeured SUV, heading to the city's sprawling botanical gardens. The vibrant colors, the shocking pink of hibiscus, the deep crimson of roses, The sun-drenched yellows of sunflowers seemed to highlight the stark contrast between their worlds. Zara, surprisingly, engaged, pointing out a flitting hummingbird, her usual quiet demeanor momentarily replaced by childlike wonder. Maya remained withdrawn, her gaze fixed on the ground, her small hands clenched tightly in her lap. "It's pretty," Maya finally whispered, her voice barely audible above the chirping of crickets and rustling leaves. Julian knelt beside her, his heart aching at her reluctance. "It is, isn't it?" he murmured, his voice soft, attempting to mirror the gentle sway of the trees around them. "Do you remember any flowers from Hope's Haven?" The question seemed to loosen something within her. A flicker of a smile, hesitant but genuine, touched her lips. The daffodils in spring. They were yellow like tiny suns. He reached out, his touch tentative, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. The contact seemed to electrify the air between them, a fragile connection slowly forming. He saw a fleeting glimpse of the little girl she once was, buried beneath layers of caution and apprehension. "I'd like to see them bloom again, next spring," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "With you." Zara, observing their quiet exchange, offered a small, reassuring smile. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the garden paths. As they walked hand in hand back to the car, Julian felt a glimmer of hope. The journey was far from over, the path ahead still fraught with challenges. But in that shared moment of quiet understanding, a seed of trust had been planted. A fragile, tentative beginning, but a beginning nonetheless. The weight of his past actions still pressed upon him, but for the first time, he felt the faintest whisper of redemption. The following weeks were a delicate dance of hesitant steps and tentative connections. Maya, ever the observer, watched Julian from behind guarded eyes, her silence a fortress. Zara, more outwardly expressive, displayed a confusing mix of curiosity and apprehension. Their shared room, once a sanctuary of shared secrets, now echoed with the unspoken anxieties of their changing lives. One evening, the aroma of freshly baked cookies filled the air, a familiar comfort from their life at Hope's Haven. Julian, attempting a fatherly gesture, joined them in the kitchen. The stark contrast between his tailored suit and the worn apron he awkwardly tied around his waist, creating a poignant image. "These smell amazing," he said, his voice tentative, watching as Zara carefully iced a cookie, her brow furrowed in concentration. Maya, however, remained silent, her gaze fixed on a chipped mug. "Grandma Rose used to make them," Zara said softly, a hint of sadness in her voice. "With cinnamon." The mention of their grandmother, a woman they spoke of with a mixture of love and loss, opened a door. Julian saw an opportunity. "Tell me about your grandma," he prompted, his voice gentle, his heart aching with a profound sense of loss he'd never known before. He understood now the extent of the emptiness he had inadvertently created in their lives. Maya surprisingly spoke. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but it held a strength that surprised Julian. She taught us to be brave," she said, her eyes fixed on the swirling pattern of the cookie dough. "Even when things were hard." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken pain. He saw the reflection of her own resilience in the warmth of her eyes, an echo of her own enduring strength in the midst of turmoil. It was a strength he was now determined to help nurture. The sweetness of the cookies became secondary, overshadowed by the emotional depth of their conversation. It was a beginning, tentative yet promising, a fragile thread of connection woven in the quiet comfort of a shared kitchen, the scent of cinnamon, a comforting blanket wrapping around their shared vulnerability. The journey was long, but the first steps were taken. The seeds of trust were sprouting. The following weeks blurred into a tapestry of small victories and larger setbacks. Julian's sprawling mansion, once a symbol of his isolating wealth, felt alien to the twins. The echoing silence of vast rooms contrasted sharply with the comforting chaos of Hope's Haven. Maya, clinging to her quiet reserve, retreated into books, her slender fingers tracing the worn pages of classic novels. Zara, more outwardly expressive, oscillated between bursts of vibrant energy and fits of quiet sadness. One afternoon, sunlight streamed through the conservatory's arched windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden rays. Julian, attempting a casual conversation, found himself floundering. "So, school starts next week," he began, his voice betraying his nervousness. He watched Zara meticulously arrange a collection of polished stones, her brow furrowed in concentration. "It's different," Zara murmured, her voice barely audible above the gentle tinkling of a nearby fountain. "Not like Hope's Haven." "I know," Julian said softly, his own heart aching with a new understanding of their loss. He wanted to bridge the gap, to reassure them, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. He knew he had to tread carefully, to let them lead the pace of their healing. Maya, finally looking up from her book, met his gaze. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, held a depth that surprised him. "It's not the school that's different, it's everything," she stated, her voice surprisingly calm. "It's like stepping into a different world." He nodded, understanding the chasm between their lives at the orphanage and his opulent world. The weight of his past actions pressed down on him, a crushing burden he was determined to alleviate. He needed to show them, not just tell them, that he was worthy of their trust, that he was there for them, not just as a wealthy benefactor, but as a present and loving father. The journey had just begun, but this quiet moment in the sun-drenched conservatory held the promise of a future where the echoes of the past faded into the warmth of a new family. The aroma of freshly baked bread, a comforting scent from the orphanage kitchen, still clung to Maya's clothes, a stark contrast to the expensive, almost sterile fragrance of Julian's mansion. He watched her, a small, almost imperceptible tremor in his hand as he reached for a glass of water. The crystal clinked softly against the polished mahogany surface of the antique table, a sound that felt jarringly out of place in the quiet tension between them. "School. It's overwhelming," Zara confessed, her voice barely a whisper, twisting a strand of her dark hair around a finger. Her usual bright eyes were clouded with a weariness that tugged at Julian's heart. He saw a reflection of his own past anxieties in her hesitant gaze. "I know," he said, his voice carefully modulated, trying to convey understanding without patronizing them. "It's a big change, but you don't have to do it alone. We can take it one step at a time." He paused, searching for the right words. The chasm between their worlds felt vast, a silent canyon separating him from the girls he'd only just discovered. He wanted to bridge that gap, to erase the years of absence, but the process felt clumsy, awkward. His attempts at casual conversation often faltered, leaving him fumbling for connection. The comfortable silence they shared in the orphanage felt a million miles away now. Maya, observing him with her usual perceptive gaze, offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. "We're trying," she replied, her voice still low, but with a hint of defiance. He saw a flicker of resilience in her dark eyes, a strength born from their life at Hope's Haven. That evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Julian found them huddled together in the library, their heads bent over a book of fairy tales, their fingers tracing the worn illustrations. The scene struck him with a sudden, poignant clarity. He wasn't just their father. He was responsible for shielding them from the harsh realities that had shaped their lives before. The weight of that responsibility settled upon him like a cloak, warm but heavy. He knew then, with absolute certainty, that this wasn't just about his redemption. It was about building a future where they could truly thrive. His journey of 1,000 miles had truly begun. The sprawling mansion felt less like a home and more like a gilded cage. Maya and Zara, perched on the edge of a plush, velvet sofa, felt the silence hum with unspoken anxieties. Sunlight streamed through the arched windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden air, a stark contrast to the simpler, cleaner light of the orphanage. Zara fidgeted, nervously twisting a silver locket clutched in her hand. "It's beautiful," Maya whispered, her gaze sweeping across the opulent room, a flicker of awe battling with apprehension. Julian, observing them from across the vast space, felt the familiar pang of guilt. He'd intended to create a haven for them, but the grandeur of his home seemed to amplify their unease. "It's a lot," he admitted, his voice softer than he intended. "But we can make it feel like home. We can change things." He crossed the room, the polished marble floor cool beneath his feet. He knelt beside them, his hands hovering uncertainly. The scent of expensive leather and old books filled the air, a stark contrast to the comforting smell of antiseptic and laundry detergent that permeated Hope's Haven. "I understand if it's overwhelming," he said, his gaze meeting Maya's. Her eyes, usually bright and inquisitive, held a shadow of fear. We can take it slow." Zara finally spoke, her voice trembling slightly. Will we still see Ms. Evelyn?" Her question hung in the air, a fragile thread of connection to their past. Julian's throat tightened. He knew the importance of maintaining that link to their familiar world. "Of course," he reassured them gently, his voice catching slightly. "We'll visit, and you can always call her." He saw a glimmer of relief in Zara's eyes, a tiny crack in the wall of apprehension. The weight of his responsibility settled upon him once more, a heavy but comforting blanket. This wasn't just about him. It was about building a secure, loving home for two girls who deserved nothing less. The therapist's office smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. Julian sat stiffly, the plush armchair doing little to ease the tension coiled in his gut. He watched Maya and Zara, perched on a smaller couch, their hands clasped together. Sunlight slanted through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden beams. A familiar image, a stark reminder of the opulent emptiness of his mansion. "They're struggling to adjust," he confessed, his voice rough. The therapist nodded, her expression sympathetic but professional. "The school, it's overwhelming. They miss Hope's Haven." Zara shifted, her eyes downcast. Maya, ever the bolder twin, spoke softly. "It's not just the school, Daddy. It's everything. Feels like another world." Julian winced. "I know," he murmured, his gaze fixed on his clasped hands. "I'm trying. I'm learning." The admission felt small, inadequate, yet it was the most honest thing he'd said in weeks. He saw a flicker of understanding in Maya's eyes, a hint of softening in the usually guarded expression. A wave of guilt washed over him, a familiar tide. He'd promised them a haven, a home, but he'd underestimated the depth of their loss, the subtle trauma of uprooting them from the only life they'd ever known. He'd been so focused on fixing his own mistakes, he'd overlooked their needs. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken anxieties and burgeoning awareness. The weight of his responsibility pressed down, a heavy but comforting blanket. He wouldn't fail them again. He wouldn't let the grandeur of his world consume the delicate blossoms of their trust. He had a lifetime to make amends. The scent of lilies, sharp and sweet, hung heavy in the air of the small, rented cottage. It was a world away from Julian's sterile mansion, a deliberate choice. He sat opposite Isabella, the twins' mother, a woman whose face held both a quiet strength and a deep weariness. Years had etched lines around her eyes, a testament to a life lived with quiet resilience. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the worn wooden floorboards. A fragile porcelain doll, salvaged from Hope's Haven, sat on the table between them, a silent witness to their uneasy truce. I wanted to apologize," Julian began, his voice thick with unshed tears. The words felt clumsy, inadequate, yet they were the truest he'd ever spoken. He'd spent weeks composing apologies in his head, each one polished and perfect, but none felt right. Only these raw, imperfect words felt genuine. Isabella looked at him, her gaze unwavering, a mixture of sadness and cautious hope in her eyes. "For what, Julian? For abandoning us? For leaving Maya and Zara to fend for themselves?" Her voice was soft, but the words carried the weight of years of unspoken pain. He nodded, unable to meet her gaze. "For everything. For the pain, the fear, the uncertainty, for robbing them of a father. The confession hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. A long silence stretched between them, filled only with the gentle ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. The ticking seemed to amplify the weight of their shared history, the years lost, the chances missed. Finally, Isabella spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "They're good girls, Julian. Strong. They've overcome so much." She reached for the porcelain doll, her fingers tracing its delicate features. "They deserve a father, a real one, not the one you were then." A sob escaped Julian, a ragged sound that broke the tension. He covered his face with his hands, the weight of his past crashing down on him. He'd built walls around his heart, brick by brick, but now, faced with the woman he'd hurt, those walls crumbled, revealing a man desperate for forgiveness and redemption. He didn't expect absolution, only understanding, and perhaps, with time, a chance to finally build something real, something lasting. He looked up, his eyes glistening, and saw Isabella's own eyes were filled with unshed tears. The quiet acceptance in her gaze offered a glimmer of hope, a promise of healing. The journey had only just begun, but for the first time, Julian felt a sense of peace, a fragile but genuine hope for a future he'd almost destroyed. The crisp autumn air nipped at Julian's cheeks as he watched Maya and Zara build a magnificent sandcastle on the beach. The rhythmic swoosh of the waves provided a calming counterpoint to the inner turmoil still churning within him. He'd brought them to this secluded beach house, a far cry from his sterile city apartment, hoping for a more relaxed atmosphere. But the girls remained guarded, their laughter brittle, their joy tinged with a hesitant reserve. "It's nice," Zara murmured, her gaze fixed on the meticulously crafted turrets of their castle. Her voice lacked the youthful exuberance he'd witnessed in other children. "It's beautiful," Julian corrected, kneeling beside them, his fingers carefully smoothing a stray grain of sand. "Just like you too." The words felt clumsy, but sincere. He longed to bridge the gap, to erase the years of absence, but the chasm felt vast and unyielding. Maya, ever the pragmatist, looked up, her dark eyes assessing him. "It's different," she said, her voice a low hum, the words hanging heavy in the crisp air. The setting sun painted the sky in fiery hues, mirroring the volatile emotions simmering beneath the surface. He saw the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, a question unanswered, a fear unspoken. It was the same fear that haunted him, the fear of rejection, the fear of failure. He reached out, hesitantly, and touched her shoulder. The contact sparked a silent understanding, a fragile connection forged in the shared experience of loss and uncertain beginnings. The waves continued their rhythmic crash, a soothing balm against the raw edges of their newfound family. He wasn't sure he deserved their trust, but he would earn it. One hesitant step, one shared smile, one carefully chosen word at a time. The sandcastle, a testament to their shared effort, stood tall against the encroaching tide, a symbol of the fragile but growing foundation of their family. The following week, Julian arranged a family outing to the city zoo. The vibrant chaos of the monkey enclosure mirrored the turmoil in his own heart. Maya, clutching a stuffed monkey almost as big as herself, remained quiet, her gaze distant. Zara, bolder, chased after a playful orangutan, her laughter a fragile sound. Julian watched them, a pang of guilt twisting in his gut. He'd envisioned picnics and laughter, not this hesitant acceptance. "It's loud," Maya whispered, her voice barely audible above the cacophony of animal sounds. "Yes, it is," Julian admitted, kneeling beside her. He felt the weight of his past mistakes pressing down on him. "But look," he pointed towards a family of gorillas. "They're noisy too, but they're still together." Zara, having tired of the orangutans, came to join them, her bright eyes shining with excitement. "Daddy," she said, the word still tentative, "can we see the lions?" The use of daddy struck Julian like a physical blow. The word resonated with a depth of emotion he hadn't anticipated. It was a tiny bridge, a fragile connection spanning the vast chasm of his past neglect. A lump formed in his throat. He swallowed hard, the taste of unshed tears bitter on his tongue. "Of course, sweetheart," he managed, his voice thick with emotion. He looked at both girls, their faces a mixture of apprehension and hesitant hope. This wasn't just about expensive gifts or lavish gestures. It was about building trust, one shared moment, one genuine connection at a time. The roar of the lions in the distance seemed to echo his own inner struggle, a primal sound of both fear and fierce protective instinct. The afternoon sun warmed their faces, yet the chill of his past actions lingered, a persistent reminder of the long road ahead, the slow, careful steps necessary to build a true family. He would continue to try, he vowed silently, determined to bridge the gap and earn their trust, one precious moment at a time. The aroma of freshly baked bread, a comforting scent from the orphanage kitchen, mingled with the crisp autumn air filtering through the open window of Julian's penthouse apartment. He sat at his massive mahogany desk, a stark contrast to the simple wooden table he'd shared with Maya and Zara just days ago at Hope's Haven. A framed photo of the twins, their shy smiles capturing a flicker of their hesitant trust, rested on the corner. He picked up his phone, the cool glass a stark contrast to the warmth he felt remembering their laughter. He scrolled through recent emails, each one a reminder of his tarnished reputation, a constant barrage of criticism and speculation. His finger hovered over a contact. His ex-lover, Isabella. He'd avoided contacting her for years, paralyzed by guilt and shame. The thought of reaching out caused a tremor in his hand. He imagined her voice, once vibrant and full of life, now perhaps laced with bitterness or disappointment. He hadn't deserved her forgiveness. Not then, not ever. Yet, the thought of Maya and Zara knowing their mother's story, only from his fragmented memories, felt wrong. He needed to understand the past to guide their future. He took a deep breath, the scent of expensive leather from his chair doing little to soothe his anxiety. He dialed the number, the ringing a stark sound in the otherwise silent room. Each ring felt like a hammer blow against his composure. The phone finally connected, a small click breaking the tension. He cleared his throat, his voice tight. "Isabella?" he began, the word catching in his throat. A pause, a pregnant silence filled with years of unspoken words and hurt. Then, a voice, softer than he remembered, answered, "Julian." The weight of the past hung heavy between them, a silent, suffocating presence. He knew this conversation wouldn't be easy, but it was a necessary step towards healing, not just for himself, but for his daughters. The future of his family hung precariously on this phone call, a fragile bridge to a reconciliation he desperately needed. The sun, a benevolent hand, warmed Julian's face as he addressed the crowd gathered outside Hope's Haven. He'd chosen this place, not his opulent penthouse, for the press conference. The scent of freshly cut grass mingled with the faint aroma of wood smoke from the distant hills. His tailored suit felt strangely out of place against the backdrop of the simple, weathered orphanage building. He wasn't here to defend himself, not anymore. For months, his voice, clear and steady, resonated through the assembled reporters. Rumors have circulated. Speculation has run rampant. Today, I choose transparency. Maya and Zara are my daughters. A wave of relief washed over him as he spoke the words aloud. The burden he'd carried for so long felt lighter. A hush fell over the crowd. Then a ripple of whispers. He saw a few sympathetic nods amidst the sea of questioning faces. Later, sitting on the worn swings in the orphanage playground with Maya and Zara, the afternoon sun casting long shadows, Julian felt a profound sense of peace. Zara, ever the pragmatist, asked, "So, does this mean we get a pony?" Maya, ever the sensitive one, squeezed his hand. "Thank you, Dad." The simple words, unburdened by years of resentment or expectation, hit him like a tidal wave. He chuckled, a genuine, unforced sound that surprised even him. "We'll see about the pony," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I promise you this, I'll always be here for you both." The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, mirroring the warmth blossoming in his heart. His redemption wasn't complete, but it had begun. The journey ahead would still be challenging, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid. He had a family, and that was all that mattered. The following weeks were a blur of adjustments. Hope's Haven, once a symbol of his fleeting publicity stunt, now felt like a second home. The scent of freshly baked bread and the gentle hum of children's laughter replaced the sterile aroma of his penthouse. He learned to navigate the creaky floorboards and the unpredictable whims of 10-year-old girls. Maya, ever cautious, took longer to warm up, her gaze often fixed on some distant point. Zara, however, was a whirlwind of questions and demands, her curiosity insatiable. One evening, nestled amongst the worn cushions of the orphanage's common room, Julian watched them play a board game, their laughter echoing through the space. The fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Zara, with a triumphant grin, swept her pieces across the board. "Checkmate, Daddy," she declared, her eyes shining with mischief. Julian's heart swelled. "Checkmate," he echoed, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He'd spent years building walls around his emotions, but these girls, with their unyielding spirit and innocent joy, were slowly dismantling them brick by brick. Maya, observing from the sidelines, finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's different," she said, her gaze fixed on the game pieces. "Different how, sweetie?" Julian asked gently, reaching out to tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear. The touch, hesitant at first, blossomed into a comforting gesture, a silent promise of his unwavering presence. "It's better," Maya conceded, a faint smile gracing her lips. The tension that had always clung to her seemed to ease. The ice was finally beginning to thaw. The warmth of the fire mirrored the growing warmth in his heart, a warmth he'd never known existed until these two girls walked into his life. The fear of failure, of not measuring up, still lingered, but it was overshadowed by an overwhelming feeling of love, a profound sense of belonging he had craved for so long. This new beginning, though uncertain, felt right, felt true, felt like home. The following weeks saw a subtle shift in Julian's public image. News outlets, initially fueled by scandal, now carried softer stories. Photos of Julian volunteering at Hope's Haven, his laughter echoing amongst the children, replaced the earlier shots of his aloof, distant self. He wasn't seeking redemption through PR. It was happening organically. The genuine warmth radiating from him was undeniable. One crisp autumn afternoon, Julian found Maya and Zara huddled by the orphanage's pond, skipping stones. The air, sharp with the scent of fallen leaves, carried the distant murmur of the city. Maya, usually reserved, was surprisingly animated, her laughter a clear, bright sound. Zara, ever the instigator, was teasing Maya about a particularly poor throw. "Daddy," Zara called out, her voice carrying a newfound confidence. "Look!" She skipped a flat stone, sending it skimming across the water's surface. It skipped 7 times before sinking. Julian approached, a smile playing on his lips. "Impressive, Zara. 7 skips. A new record." He knelt beside them, the damp earth cool against his knees. He felt a profound sense of peace, a belonging he'd never known. Maya, glancing at him shyly, offered him a small, hesitant smile. "It's nice," she whispered, her eyes mirroring the stillness of the pond. "Being here, with you." The words, simple yet profound, resonated deeply within him. He reached out, gently taking her hand. Her touch, no longer withdrawn, was surprisingly warm. He felt a surge of gratitude, a wave of overwhelming emotion. The years of emotional distance, of self-imposed isolation, were finally beginning to melt away. He wasn't just a wealthy benefactor anymore. He was a father, and this simple moment, by the quiet pond, felt more valuable than all his worldly possessions combined. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. As the 3 of them walked back towards the orphanage, hand in hand, Julian knew this wasn't just a new beginning for him. It was a new beginning for them all. The city's relentless hum faded as Julian stepped into the quiet sanctuary of Hope's Haven. The scent of freshly baked bread and faintly soapy laundry hung in the air, a comforting contrast to the sterile fragrance of his own penthouse. He watched Maya and Zara, engrossed in a game of checkers on the worn porch, sunlight dappling their dark hair. Their laughter, light and unrestrained, tugged at something deep within him. "They seem happy," he murmured to Ms. Evans, the orphanage director, her kind eyes reflecting the setting sun. Ms. Evans smiled, a knowing glimmer in her eyes. "They're thriving, Julian, finding their place, their rhythm." He nodded, the weight of his past actions pressing down on him. He'd spent years building a wall around his heart, but these girls, these two tiny souls, had somehow breached it. Later, huddled around a crackling fire in the orphanage's small common room, Julian watched Zara carefully arrange marshmallows on a stick. Maya, usually quiet, spoke animatedly about her school project, her voice filled with a newfound confidence. "It's about the constellations," she explained, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "I'm learning about all the stars." Julian felt a lump forming in his throat. He'd never known this kind of connection, this innocent joy. "That's wonderful, Maya," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Tell me more." As the evening progressed, the conversation flowed effortlessly. He learned about their dreams, their fears, their hopes for the future. He listened, truly listened, for the first time in years. The crackling fire cast dancing shadows on their faces, painting their expressions with a warmth that mirrored the growing connection between them. He felt a shift within himself, a loosening of the armor he'd worn for so long. The path to redemption wasn't easy, but it was undeniably beautiful. The following weeks unfolded in a gentle rhythm. Maya and Zara, initially hesitant, began to blossom. The orphanage, once a place of quiet resilience, now held the sound of their laughter echoing through the hallways. Julian, watching from the sidelines, felt the icy grip of his past slowly thawing. He'd traded power suits for comfortable sweaters, boardroom meetings for story time. One crisp autumn afternoon, Julian found Maya sketching in the garden, her brow furrowed in concentration. The scent of damp earth and chrysanthemums filled the air. "What are you drawing?" he asked softly, settling beside her. Maya, startled, looked up. "It's a phoenix," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Rising from ashes." He saw a reflection of her own journey in the delicate lines on the page, a parallel to his own. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Just like you." Later that evening, curled up on the worn sofa in the common room, Zara confided in him about her anxieties about school. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on her face, highlighting the vulnerability in her eyes. "I don't want to disappoint you," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. Julian reached out, his hand gently covering hers. "Disappoint me? My darling girl, you could never do that. I just want you to be happy, to be yourselves." His heart ached with the weight of his past negligence, but in that moment, he felt a profound sense of purpose. The next day, Julian surprised them with a trip to the city's art museum. The vast halls, filled with centuries of artistry, initially overwhelmed them, but soon, their fascination ignited. Watching Maya's eyes widen at a Monet, Zara's quiet contemplation of a Rodin sculpture filled him with a joy he'd never known. He felt a shift within, a letting go of the man he used to be, replaced by a father who was finally ready to embrace his daughters' lives completely. The city lights twinkled outside, a soft counterpoint to the warm glow of their shared experience. This wasn't a publicity stunt anymore. This was a family. The following months were a blur of adjustments. Maya and Zara, initially shy and hesitant, blossomed under Julian's unexpectedly gentle care. The plush comfort of his penthouse apartment felt foreign at first, a stark contrast to the simple, shared rooms of Hope's Haven. Yet Julian ensured their old life wasn't erased. He arranged for them to continue their music lessons, their favorite teacher making weekly visits. The scent of Zara's lavender soap, a familiar comfort from the orphanage, still lingered in their new bathroom. One evening, huddled around a crackling fireplace in Julian's vast library, Maya confessed, "It feels strange having so much." Her eyes, usually bright and curious, held a flicker of unease. Julian knelt beside her, his expensive suit feeling suddenly out of place. "Strange how?" he asked softly, his voice mirroring her quiet tone. "It's like we're living in a fairy tale," Zara chimed in, her voice a little hesitant. "But fairy tales don't always have happy endings." A wave of guilt washed over Julian. He understood their apprehension. He'd thrown them into a world drastically different from the one they knew. "Happy endings are earned, my darlings," he said, his voice firm yet gentle. "And we'll work on building ours together. This isn't a fairy tale, it's our life, and we'll write it however we choose." He held their hands, feeling the warmth of their small fingers intertwined with his. The weight of his past mistakes felt lighter, replaced by a determination to be the father he never was. The firelight danced across their faces, casting long shadows that seemed to symbolize their journey out of darkness and into a hopeful new dawn. The scent of old books and burning wood filled the air, a comforting counterpoint to the uncertain emotions swirling in the room. This wasn't just about wealth or amends. This was about building a genuine family, a bond stronger than any apology. The following weeks saw a gradual shift. Maya, initially clinging to her worn, well-loved stuffed rabbit, began to explore Julian's art collection, her fingers tracing the delicate lines of a porcelain figurine. Zara, ever practical, organized his overflowing bookshelf, her quiet efficiency a soothing balm to his chaotic schedule. The penthouse, once a symbol of his isolating wealth, began to feel like a home. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a mundane detail that felt comforting in its normalcy. One evening, Julian found them huddled in the conservatory, sunlight painting their faces gold. Maya was attempting, with some frustration, to play a complex Chopin piece on a miniature grand piano. Zara, perched on a stool beside her, offered gentle encouragement. "It's difficult," Maya sighed, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Not impossible," Zara corrected softly, her fingers lightly touching Maya's hand. "Remember what Ms. Evans always says? Practice makes perfect." Julian watched them, a lump forming in his throat. The quiet strength of their bond, forged in the shared hardships of Hope's Haven, filled him with a profound sense of awe. This wasn't about fixing a past mistake. It was about cherishing a present miracle. He cleared his throat. "Need a hand?" he asked, his voice unexpectedly shaky. Maya looked up, her eyes widening slightly. Zara smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that reached her eyes. "Maybe," Maya admitted, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. The air crackled with unspoken emotions, a complex tapestry woven with apprehension, affection, and the tentative beginnings of trust. Later that night, as he tucked them into their luxuriously appointed beds, Maya whispered, "Thank you, Daddy." The word, so simple, yet so profound, sent a jolt of unexpected emotion through him. He brushed a stray curl from her forehead, his heart swelling with a love he'd never known he was capable of. He knew the journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, Julian Thorne felt a genuine sense of hope. The future, once a desolate landscape of regrets, now held the promise of a blossoming family, a future written not in fairy tales, but in the quiet, shared moments of everyday life. The following months unfolded in a blur of ballet classes, piano recitals, and whispered secrets shared in the hushed corners of Julian's sprawling penthouse. Maya, blossoming into a graceful young dancer, filled the apartment with the lilting melodies of her practice sessions. Zara, ever the pragmatist, organized their new lives with quiet efficiency, her calm presence anchoring them both. The scent of Maya's lavender-scented lotion mingled with the rich aroma of Zara's freshly baked cookies, creating a comforting olfactory tapestry of their newfound normalcy. One crisp autumn afternoon, Julian found them huddled over a chessboard in the sun-drenched library, the scent of old books and polished wood filling the air. The rhythmic click of the chess pieces punctuated the quiet intensity of their game. "Checkmate," Zara announced, a faint smile playing on her lips. Maya frowned, her concentration unwavering even in defeat. "Again?" she asked, her voice tinged with playful frustration. Julian watched them, a wave of warmth washing over him. He saw not just his daughters, but two distinct individuals, each with their own unique strengths and vulnerabilities. He cleared his throat. "Impressive," he said, his voice a little hoarse. "You've both improved considerably." Zara looked up, her gaze meeting his. "We practice," she replied simply, her eyes sparkling with pride. Maya nodded in agreement, a hint of shyness coloring her cheeks. That evening, nestled on a plush sofa before a roaring fireplace, Julian shared a quiet moment with Maya. He recounted a childhood memory, a vivid picture of himself, much younger and already consumed by ambition, yet still holding on to the innocence that life seemed determined to steal from him. He watched Maya listening intently, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words barely audible above the crackling fire. Julian gently wiped away the tear. "For what, my love?" he asked softly. "For everything," she replied. "For leaving us." Julian pulled her closer, his heart aching with a mixture of guilt and a profound, blossoming love. He knew the road ahead was long, marked by challenges and adjustments. But in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of his family and the comforting glow of the fire, he felt a profound sense of peace. His past mistakes wouldn't define him. His future, he knew, would be woven from the threads of love, forgiveness, and a family finally found. The penthouse suite, usually a stage for lavish parties, felt strangely intimate. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Julian watched Zara, meticulously organizing a collection of vintage postcards, a quiet intensity in her movements. Maya, perched on a plush velvet armchair, sketched furiously in a large notebook, her brow furrowed in concentration. The air hummed with a comfortable silence, punctuated only by the scratch of pencil on paper and the soft rustle of cards. "How's the portrait coming along?" Julian asked, his voice soft, hesitant. Maya looked up, a shy smile gracing her lips. "It's difficult," she admitted, tilting her head. "Capturing your essence." He chuckled, a genuine, warm sound that surprised even him. "My essence? I'm not sure I have one anymore, not after." He trailed off, the weight of his past threatening to overwhelm him. Zara looked up from her postcards, her expression thoughtful. "You have many essences, Papa," she said gently. "The one you show the world, the one you showed us at the orphanage, and the one we're seeing now." Her words struck him. The weight of his lies, his calculated public persona, felt heavy, a suffocating cloak he had worn for far too long. He cleared his throat. "I'm trying to be better," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "Better than the man I used to be." Maya, ever perceptive, nodded understandingly. "It's okay to make mistakes," she said softly, her gaze meeting his. "What matters is that you're trying." The statement, so simple, so profoundly true, resonated deeply within him. He felt a surge of hope, a fragile, tentative feeling he had almost forgotten. He crossed the room, kneeling beside Maya, running a gentle hand over her hair. He felt the warmth of her skin, the soft texture of her hair, a sensory experience that connected him to her on a fundamental level. In that moment, the penthouse suite didn't feel like a gilded cage, but a sanctuary, a haven where a family was painstakingly, tenderly, being built. The journey had been harrowing, but in the quiet intimacy of this afternoon, Julian felt the first stirrings of a truly fulfilling life. The crisp autumn air bit at Julian's cheeks as he walked Maya and Zara through Central Park. Leaves, a fiery tapestry of red and gold, crunched under their feet. Maya, ever the observer, pointed out a squirrel burying nuts, her eyes alight with fascination. Zara, more reserved, trailed behind, kicking at fallen leaves, a small frown furrowing her brow. The park, usually a backdrop to his hurried business lunches, felt different now, vibrant with the quiet joy of shared experience. "It's beautiful, Papa," Maya breathed, her voice barely audible above the rustling leaves. He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, a stark contrast to the practiced smiles of his past. That evening, back in the penthouse, a quiet tension hung in the air. The girls were settling into their new, luxurious surroundings with a hesitant grace. The opulent furnishings, once symbols of his success, now felt oddly out of place. He found himself drawn to the simple sketch Maya had made earlier, a charcoal rendering of him that captured a surprising depth of understanding. You made me look kind," he said, a note of self-deprecating humor in his voice. Maya blushed, her eyes darting to the floor. I tried to capture the part of you that's good," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Zara, observing from across the room, spoke quietly. "He's trying, Maya. Give him time." Her words, though simple, carried the weight of their shared journey. The unspoken acknowledgement of their father's flaws, his past mistakes, and his ongoing efforts at redemption created a sense of quiet understanding and fragile hope. The expensive furnishings seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the warmth of shared vulnerability and the promise of a future built on honest connection. He saw in his daughter's eyes not just forgiveness, but a nascent trust, a tentative acceptance of the father they were slowly getting to know. The weight of his past still lingered, but the warmth of the moment, the genuine connection with his daughters, provided a glimmer of light, a promise of a brighter future, one he was finally ready to fight for. The following Christmas, the penthouse shimmered with festive lights, a stark contrast to the quiet warmth of Hope's Haven. Maya, in a shimmering red dress, giggled as she chased Zara, who wore a sophisticated emerald green, around the towering Christmas tree. Julian watched, a lump forming in his throat. The scent of pine and gingerbread hung heavy in the air, a comforting aroma that replaced the sterile antiseptic smell of the orphanage. "Papa," Maya called, her breath puffing out in little white clouds. "Look!" She held up a meticulously crafted ornament, a tiny, clay replica of their family. It was clumsy, but undeniably heartfelt. He knelt, his expensive suit feeling strangely out of place amidst the childlike wonder. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He gently took the ornament, his fingers brushing against hers. The touch, once so stiff and awkward, now felt natural, comfortable. That night, nestled amongst plush pillows and blankets in his spacious study, he read them a story. Zara, unusually talkative, pointed out a detail in the illustrations, her voice soft yet confident. He looked at his daughters, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the lamp, and felt a surge of gratitude. The past still haunted him, a shadow lurking at the edges of his happiness, but it no longer held the power to consume him. The next morning, Julian received a call. Hope's Haven needed significant repairs. He didn't hesitate. Using his influence, he secured funding, not just for Hope's Haven, but for several other underfunded orphanages. His public image, once tarnished, was slowly being rebuilt, not through carefully crafted PR, but through genuine acts of compassion. He realized true wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the love and connection he now shared with his family. The girls, witnessing their father's quiet acts of kindness, were learning a valuable lesson about using their privilege for good. This Christmas, the gifts weren't just material things. They were the gifts of a father's love, a family's bond, and a future built on redemption and hope. The scent of pine needles, the warmth of their shared laughter, and the quiet intimacy of their bond were the most precious treasures of all. The penthouse suite, usually a sterile display of wealth, hummed with a different energy. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden rays. Maya, sprawled on a plush rug, practiced her violin, the melody both hesitant and hopeful. Zara, perched on a velvet chaise lounge, sketched furiously in a large notebook. her brow furrowed in concentration. Julian watched them, a quiet smile playing on his lips. The sharp edges of his grief had softened, replaced by a gentler, more familiar ache, the kind that comes with love. "Papa," Maya said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Ms. Evans says I'm ready for the youth orchestra auditions." A hint of apprehension flickered in her eyes, a stark contrast to the confident notes flowing from her violin. Julian rose, crossing the room with a grace he hadn't possessed before. He knelt beside her, the expensive fabric of his trousers feeling strangely insignificant. "And you will be wonderful, my dear," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "Remember what we practiced? Breathe, feel the music, let it flow through you." He gently adjusted her bow, his touch light, reassuring. Zara looked up, her charcoal-smudged fingers pausing mid-stroke. "I'm entering my art into the school competition," she announced, her voice a little less shy than usual. "It's a self-portrait." "A self-portrait?" Julian asked, intrigued. He knew her art showcased a depth beyond her years, an understanding of light and shadow that mirrored her own quiet strength. "Yes," she replied, a small smile finally gracing her lips. "It's different this time. I think it shows more of who I am now." The air crackled with unspoken emotions. The transformation hadn't been easy, for any of them. The initial awkwardness, the lingering shadows of the past, had slowly given way to a fragile, precious connection. It was a journey of healing, one painstaking step at a time. The sterile opulence of the penthouse was fading, replaced by the warmth of a family slowly finding its footing. Julian felt the beginnings of a deep satisfaction, not the fleeting pleasure of a successful deal, but the enduring joy of a father's love. Weeks later, the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of Maya's practice echoed through the sprawling family room, a stark contrast to the initial silence that had hung heavy after their arrival. The scent of freshly baked cookies, a new addition to their lives courtesy of Julian's surprisingly adept baking skills, filled the air. Sunlight warmed the polished hardwood floor, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden afternoon light, a scene strikingly similar to the penthouse, yet imbued with a different, warmer energy. Zara, sprawled on a plush rug, her sketchbook open, occasionally glanced up, her charcoal-smudged fingers pausing to watch Maya. "That's beautiful, Maya," Zara murmured, her voice barely a whisper. Her gaze held a mixture of pride and something akin to awe. The self-portraits she'd been creating now held a newfound confidence, a vibrant expression of the blooming sisterhood. Maya, mid-phrase, stopped playing. The music hung in the air, incomplete, yet resonant. "It's different," she admitted, her own eyes reflecting the changing light. "Playing for you feels different." Julian, watching from his armchair, felt a warmth spread through him, a deep, abiding satisfaction that transcended the fleeting highs of his business successes. He'd learned to listen, truly listen, to the quiet language of their emotions. The girls' hesitant steps towards him, their slow, cautious trust, filled him with a quiet joy. He'd replaced the sterile perfection of his penthouse with the comforting chaos of family life, and it felt infinitely more rewarding. He rose, crossing the room, his steps deliberate and calm. He knelt beside Maya, his touch gentle as he placed a hand on her shoulder. "Different how?" he asked, his voice soft. Maya hesitated, then looked up, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "It's like, the music isn't just notes anymore," she whispered. "It's like it has a story, and it's our story." Zara nodded, her own eyes glistening. "Yeah," she agreed, "like a melody of us." Julian swallowed, his throat tight with emotion. He understood. Their shared music, their budding art, were testaments to the healing that had begun. The journey had been fraught with challenges, their past scars still visible, but the present glowed with a fragile promise of enduring love. The sterile opulence was fading, and in its place bloomed the vibrant colors of a family. The crisp autumn air swirled fallen leaves around Julian's feet as he walked Maya and Zara to school. The girls, bundled in brightly colored scarves, chattered excitedly about a school project, their voices a melodic counterpoint to the rustling leaves. A subtle shift had occurred. The initial awkwardness had melted, replaced by a comfortable ease. Julian found himself smiling, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, a far cry from the practiced smiles of his past. He watched them disappear through the school gates,